Onward through our fire and blood journey, we continue. Aegon's conquest took a lot of preparation, though perhaps less than one would normally guess at for an endeavor of this magnitude. Perhaps surprisingly as well, he announced his claim on the Seven Kingdoms before making the vast majority of those preparations. He didn't even give himself time to gear up before putting everyone on notice. Was that a mistake? If so, not one that made a lot of difference. It still all worked out pretty well. But I do rather believe it to be consistent with his actions throughout both the conquest and his reign. He always projects an aura of superiority. He never treats anyone like an equal, even those who may appear to be stronger. He just sets about proving that no, they were not, in fact, stronger. He was the one that was stronger. And this comes up in a lot of different ways, not just militaristically, politically, intrigue, everything. Just everything about Aegon suggests superiority. You won't be his ally. You will bend the knee, or else. He doesn't use a lot of deception or cunning. He uses some. But mostly he just comes right at you. There's definitely a method to this boss attitude, which is that no one afterwards can claim that he isn't the strongest. He leaves no doubt. And it worked. He intended for everyone to be in awe of what he and his family and their dragons could do, which is a testament to holding peace for the long term. No one's going to challenge that. Well, then things are going to stay peaceful. Throughout this episode and going forward, we'll see just how Aegon does it. We'll keep an eye on his strategy and all the nuances within, because it sounds very straightforward, but it's an intelligent thing. It's an intelligent plan. It's almost ironic, actually, the nuance and subtlety present in this extremely direct approach. It's remarkably foresighted, too. Right, conquer in a way that leaves no doubt to how your reign will be carried out. Face every challenge head on so that the realm doesn't see it as a close one thing. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It was pretty definitive. Make sure everyone knows that. If it had been a much bigger challenge, Aegon still would have won. So there's not a lot of room there. Win by a mile, and what's anyone going to do about it? Well, they're going to be cowed. Probably. All that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast.
You say 6 out of 7 were cowed.
6 out of 7 were cowed. That's right. Hello and welcome, everybody. Our live streams for Fire and Blood, as all of our live streams are, except during TV season, are at 3 p.m. on Eastern on YouTube. Every video is on YouTube and Spotify afterwards. That's right. All the videos are on Spotify. At least for the run of Fire and Blood, every episode is posted as a video. Audio only episodes are available everywhere you find podcasts, and they are ad-free if you listen to them on Patreon. There's no ad-free videos on Patreon, though, unfortunately. There's just too much bandwidth. Videos are much larger than audio files, so it's hard for us to have multiple copies of those. But anyway, we give you lots of choices and different ways to experience our show. How's it going, Sean? Looks like you got some red and black there. You're very Targaryen looking.
Yeah, might be hard to see the detail, but these are intertwined, 3 intertwined dragons.
Nice, very appropriate. My shirt also a little hard to see, but I got Dragonstone on my shirt. Also, we got similar colors. I got a little yellow in mine for the clouds and sun, but the red of the mountains. And I got this plant dangling here in front of me to make it even harder to see my shirt.
You know whose shirt is hardest to see?
Yours.
Yeah.
Well, what is it, though?
I'm wearing a Game of Owns shirt.
Nice. Shout out to Game of Owns.
Yeah, I am. I also have a cat in my lap under a blanket.
Oh, very warm cat. Fire and cuddles? Yeah. Fire and purrs? I don't know. We'll work on that. We'll workshop that one.
Don't think there's no blood. Cat's claws are sharp.
They are, yes. Even when they're being cuddly, they cut you. And what about that drink? That is bright red, Sean.
Yeah, I was going to say, I got a blood red drink here. It's a little diluted from ice, but it's just blood.
Yeah, so it's fire. It's blood and ice. So fire and blood, fire. You got blood and ice. Yeah, there you can hear the ice clinking. I, of course, just have coffee in a mug instead of a thermos, though. Woohoo, very different.
This is the Rainbow Machine naked drink. I mean, I also have like a Bang and a Mountain Dew and a sparkling ice mixed in there. But
of course. Who doesn't?
Yeah.
Of course, yes. Everyone is with you on that.
But the Rainbow Machine naked drink is thick blood red.
Yeah.
It's good.
Shout out to our good friend Nina. Check her out at goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's one L in alley. 2 N's though in Allison, but it's Good Queen Alley. So there's no
How many
N's
L's
except
in
the
good and
N.
queen?
None, actually. It's not glued Queenal Alley. The latest blog post is regarding a question she received about Catelyn and approving of Arya's interests in swords and horses. And the question is basically, if Arya had done well at courtesy and etiquette, would Catelyn have been more forgiving about her taking on quote unquote, man's tasks?
Yeah, Arya was clearly into the patriarchy. She loved horses. As soon as she learned the patriarchy wasn't just about horses, she lost
Like,
interest.
screw this.
Lost interest. Yeah.
This is terrible. So yeah, throughout this episode, we'll encounter topics that we've done full episodes on already, and we'll point them out as we go along. So at the end, we'll list some of those off, and you can check them out if you haven't already, or have long ago and are thinking of staying immersed in Westeros and the wonderful world of A Song of Ice and Fire. If you want more, we've got you covered. The list of episodes we have that are connected to these topics today, as I said last week, is long. A lot of O's in long, a couple of N's, maybe a couple of G's. Yeah, all that.
I wanted to make a quick note about your intro. I mean, there's a lot of notes to make in there, and we'll go on about it a lot. But just going back to something we talked about last week, I think Aegon might have planned this better than it seems on the surface.
Yeah.
That, like you said, some of this coming at you straight on. It seems that way because he chose the moment when he was able to come at you straight on.
That's true.
Does that make sense?
That is true.
And to be fair, he didn't come at everyone straight on, right? Yeah, I think that he knew he needed to go after Heron straight on.
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, other people would cow. Like, they would be happy he did it, would realize that they couldn't beat him if Heron couldn't, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, that I just want to give him a little bit more credit for not just being like, I'm stronger than you, bow to me. I think even though on the surface it seems like that, I think there was a lot of strategy behind the moments and that he chose and the order that he chose of his battles.
Yeah, I agree.
That allowed for that superficial impression.
It wasn't like his only move or that his ego drove him or pride to do that. It was calculated. Like, this is how a king should behave. I'm going to fall within these lines of what I think the right attitude to project is, and he was naturally pretty good at it on top of all that, I think. And that maybe is what makes it seem like it was just his only gear that happened to work. But no, I agree with you. I think there was a lot of method to that so-called madness. The Targaryen coin flip, there's a lot of genius, and this was a genius flip, not a madness flip that happened to work out.
And that is another dynamic of war strategy, I guess, is that there's a lot of value to winning overwhelmingly.
Yes.
Not only the stability that you get after the fact, but there's just less casualties. When you have a close pitched battle that stretches out for a long time, so many more people die. But when you win decisively, there's less casualties and there's less strife after the fact.
And you're with that boss attitude as well, or if you intend to continue conquering after, what stepping stones, you take one foe down, you move on to the next one. You want to add as many of their soldiers to your army as possible. So you also don't want to kill them all. Also don't want to kill a lot of them. But if it's a close run thing, that tends to be the result when two sides are evenly matched. They have to wear each other down. But if one can just dominate the other one right away, then it's just over, and fewer things are destroyed. And whether that's going to be used for future conquests or just people are still alive, that's a good thing in and of itself.
Right. Even what you want to rule, like beyond just the winning of the battles at the initiation of the conquer, but the thing you conquer, you don't want to be ashes. You don't want to be a bunch of orphans and people mad at you. You'd rather it be a land that's still stable and intact, that had minimal casualties, that is thankful for you having gotten rid of the villain Heron or whoever, and is trusting of your decisions to manage things well. Because like you said too, his boss attitude wasn't total arrogance or a bully, right?
Yeah.
He wasn't just there to push everyone around. He was there to unite the realm so that there would be peace and stability. And maybe he had some personal ulterior motives, but whatever they were, they didn't seem to be so he could rape all the women or take all the gold back to Valyria or whatever else. He seemed to just rule calculatedly well, I'll say, for an extended period of time. So.
To be fair, a lot of these things fall off when we get to Dorne. Like, he did just kind of destroy it all because they didn't bend the knee. It was like, well, if I'm going to destroy it, I have to destroy it. Now so he was willing to do that if it came to that, but it was definitely not plan A or probably even plan B. So there's definitely some negative aspects to that. But that's all part of the picture here. We'll be covering it all as we move forward. Let's do our trivia question real quick. Who's the only person we know of to strike Aegon the Conqueror with a blade? Now, there are probably some other cases, but we don't know them, or we don't know them by name. We know that there were assassination attempts, things like that, but there's only one that I could find where someone actually cut him. So who was that did that? Let's start with the claiming Westeros. That started with sending out a bunch of ravens. It's a Stannis parallel. Sending out ravens to the entire realm, claiming to be king, only to be met with scorn. To be fair, Stannis was met with more scorn than this, though, also to be fair, we don't exactly know the level of scorn heaped on Aegon here. Either way, here's the quote.
On the 7th day, a cloud of ravens burst from the towers of Dragonstone to bring Lord Aegon's word to the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. To the 7 kings they flew, to the citadel of Old Town, to lords both great and small. All carried the same message. From this day forth, there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles. Those who took up arms against him would be thrown down, humbled, and destroyed.
Cue the little man from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, saying he ain't lying. Now, of course, it turns out that candidate that that this little man was standing for turned out to be a white supremacist, a KKK member. So we'll forget that part. But hey, these are the Targaryens, right? So hey, it kind of works, right? But that is exactly what happened. Those who took up arms against him were thrown down, humbled, and destroyed for the most part. There may be an exception or two. But yeah, that was what a message to receive. Imagine you're like the Lord of Casterly Rock, which is this time was Loren the First Lannister, and later Loren the Last, because we know how that went. What do you do if you're him? You're like, this guy just claims to be king of us all now? You've been king of a line that's been in place for like 8,000 years. Who is this guy? Like, he's saying he's king of all of us now? Like, they've all been squabbling with each other. It's said that there's hardly a year goes by where one kingdom doesn't fight another. And the kingdoms largely have the same borders they've had for a long time. Like maybe here and there, border gets pushed inward a bit, but then maybe gets pushed back and then a little way the other. Not large changes, other than what was happening in the Riverlands, which was pretty substantial. But that state of affairs had been going for hundreds of years too. So what a thing to react to. It's hard to put yourself in those heads of these very proud, long-standing families. Like the Gardeners even more so would have been prouder than the Lannisters. And because their family is like perhaps the most celebrated family in Westeros. Maybe not even perhaps, because of all the different families that believe their family traces to Garth Greenhand, and the Gardeners like at the top of that family tree. Them most of all perhaps would be like, this is ridiculous. Of course we're not gonna. What a jerk. We're not gonna stand for this. Of course we'll face this man and set him back and show him what for, or whatever language they used. So that would be Mern the Ninth who would be saying that, and his family would be probably pumping him up like, yeah, that silly island Targaryen guy. What's he thinking? This is a huge insult. We'll show him.
From several different angles, I suppose. Even if someone did realize, if this guy's really coming after us with dragons, I don't think we can beat him. There were probably at least a few people that had that insight.
Yeah, maybe not the kings, but some people, yes.
Yeah. But they probably still knew the king can't just be like, all right, sure. They have to make a show of force. They have to at least superficially call the banners, say, who do you think you are? And Aegon probably realized that too. He probably knew they wouldn't just be like, okay, sure. He knew that there would have to be some show of force, some battles, some blood's going to have to be shed. But again, he and probably the wiser of the rulers wanted to keep it to a minimum.
Yeah, I agree. For example, Torrhen Stark, he did exactly what you said. He did bend the knee. But he gathered his army and marched south first. And it was after he saw Harrenhal and was like, oh my god, look at that. He burned Harrenhal. It's melting, that thing. Like, his lords and soldiers all saw that too. So they had the visual evidence and that maybe would enable him to bend the knee with fewer people complaining about it, because they all saw what he saw and were like, yeah, we don't want to fight that. That said, several people were still willing to fight that, as we're saying, but we'll get to that later. So instead of the little man from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, we have Lord Monkeyface to utter the line in Westeros. Lord Monkeyface is not a little person. He is hirsute and hunchback, though, a court fool, Visenya's fool, and not little as far as we know. Called Lord Monkeyface because of all his hairiness, I think. And maybe a little more about Lord Monkeyface later. That's, again, Visenya's. And we're not sure when Lord Monkeyface died, but sometime before Visenya. So that's all we know. Visenya lives for quite a while after this. The Seven Kings weren't, of course, all kings. There was King Ronald Arryn, but Ronald was a boy, so effectively in charge was Queen Regent Shara Arryn, Princess Maria Martell, the Yellow Toad, also not a king, but the equivalent of a king. King Loren Lannister, we said, Loren the First, King Meryn the Ninth Gardener, King Harren Hor the Black, King Torrhen Stark, the King who knelt, and King Argilac Durndon. Now, King Argilac, assuredly one of those who was like, I'm not bending the knee. Like, you don't get a name like Arrogant and just bend the knee without a fight. This guy went down swinging as much as anyone. But again, we're not quite there yet.
Even he, though, going down swinging, prideful and arrogant as he may have been, didn't ruin his troops. He didn't ruin his land. He didn't send everyone else into the suicide mission.
That's true. Unsurprisingly, no, as Sean said, no one actually bent the knee. Some definitely held back, though. Not everyone rushed to fight him. It was not like they were all eager to get him. They may have wanted to get him, but they weren't eager to do it for obvious reasons.
Just to clarify, no one immediately bent the knee.
Right, no one immediately bent the knee. Other than, I suppose, his existing vassals, but they were already his existing vassals. They had already bent the knee. Now they were re-bending the knee to a king instead of a lord. Not a big difference, given it's the same person. Although a big difference in terms of what they were about to be asked to do. Like, oh boy, here we go. Velaryon and Celtigar and all them are like, here we go. Now, one famous and important example of holding back entirely and not fighting at all is the High Septon, and thus Lord Manfred Hightower, the Lord of the Hightower at the time, something we cover in our Under the Dragons episodes there for House Hightower. So that's a pretty big deal to have the High Septon say, let's not do that, which immediately pulled a lot of troops back from death, because they probably would have just been burned on the field of fire. I don't think they would have made any difference. So it was a good thing the High Septon did, whether it was truly a vision or just something he played off for maximum effect, which I definitely lean towards that, because it was exactly 7 days and it just so convenient. Everything was very convenient about it, but it's the good kind of convenient. This is not the kind of politicking I'm cynical about. I'm like, yes, this guy used politics to save lives. Good for him. He may have been thinking of his own life, but he certainly did it in a way that saved a lot of people's lives, and Lord Manfred Hightower as well. On the other hand, there was an exception to them not working together. That's an interesting point here, is that if they wanted to take on Aegon, well, why didn't they team up? Why didn't they gang up on him? Why didn't they work together to fight him? Well, in part because they had rarely done so in the past. They don't get along very well. They don't have strong relationships. They don't probably talk that often anyway. So they're very proud people. It's hard for them to work together. How do they even meet? Where do they even meet? Like, where's a neutral central location for them to meet? And if they do that, are they risking some sort of attack by gathering in a place where someone could get them all at once?
And how long would it take to get there? And how long would it take to get back?
Yeah, how much time do they have? Yeah.
Would the agreement made while they were there still be in place, given all the other changing factors by the time they got back?
So on the other hand, there was an exception to them not working together. There were a few offers to work with Aegon. We'll get to those in a minute. King Mern rode to meet with King Lorne. So they had a meeting apparently in Casterly Rock. So that's a safe place to have a meeting. Casterly Rock, one of the safest places there is. Well, at least if you're a Lannister. Although there's exceptions to that too. Like if you're a Casterly and Land the Clover's coming for you. But hey. King Mern and King Lorne clearly had a discussion that eventually led to them uniting their armies, which battle is still a ways away. It's a big old meta point, though, isn't it? The fact that they couldn't unite against a common enemy is a reason why Westeros needed to be united. If Aegon's dream was driving him at all here, it's just driving that point home. Like, when winter comes, look at these people. They just fight each other. You know, like, that's not going to work in the long term. You got to be united for the real threatening common enemy. If you can't unite now, you won't unite later. So there's a way that he can justify it. That's the argument anyway. The conquest is justified because it unites the realm for the coming darkness, and it created so much peace before that. Like, fewer lives were lost per year after the conquest than before, I think, by a lot. So it's one of those things where sometimes, you know, if you prefer peace in the real world, it's like, well, there are times like this where strength creates peace. But people die to set that up, and that's where the moral conundrums come in. Like, why do some people have to die for other people's peace? You know, well, I don't know. Big ethical.
There's other, too deep for us to get into but there's other sacrifices to be made, right? For the sake of peace, you might sacrifice independence and liberty and tax money and so on else, you know.
Yes. And if we're being fair, to date, who's wrought more destruction on the Seven Kingdoms? Dragons or the others? Probably dragons. Almost certainly dragons.
Yeah.
But give it time. Give it time. We'll see. We'll revisit that question at the end of it all. It still might be dragons, especially if you could include metaphorical dragons like the Targaryens. But that's a conversation for later. Very good question, though, to think about. Put that in the back of your mind. Marinate on it for a minute or a longer time. And Nina adds, it's not like the various native rulers of Westeros were all evil, oppressive overlords who enjoyed making people suffer. Harrenhal being an exception to that rule. He definitely made people suffer. I don't know if he enjoyed it, but he definitely did it, so it doesn't really matter if he enjoyed it or not. If presented the choice, would they have refused to fight the others if they had actually come? Would these lords have just refused to unite against that common enemy if it was actually presented to them? We don't know. We'll probably find that out in A Song of Ice and Fire, because some of them probably won't, but a lot of them probably will. And it'll be really interesting to see where those chips fall.
Here's the thing. Even if they did agree to work together because this real threat was coming, wouldn't it be nice to have already been working together,
Yeah,
to already have a structure in place and a system of chain of command and everything else? Even if they did at the last minute realize they need to work together, it might be too late because they don't have enough organization and trust and everything else.
That's a good point. Yeah. If Westeros, and Nina also adds, hey, whatever might happen in the future, Westeros did unite back in the day during the Long Night to repel the others. Now, maybe not everyone was on board. We don't know, but it was enough. Whatever happened, humanity, enough people fought the others during the Long Night to be successful. So there was some united... Well, there was some unity. There was no united government that we know of. No, whatever united them all is it Azor Ahai? Is it Brandon the Builder? We don't know. Is it some other person, some figure that's referred to as under one of those names? It was actually some different individual. We don't know. But there doesn't appear to have been some person that became king of everyone to lead this effort. It seems to have been a united group, perhaps individuals in the heat of the moment pulled people together and emerged as leaders among these disparate organizations and kingdoms. But yeah, there wasn't one central leader that we know of. I mean, maybe Azor Ahai was exactly that, but I don't think he was like the king of Westeros temporarily. The legends don't really speak to that. So, or she maybe.
even so, it may be that there was an amount of unity. But it still also might be that some magical force defeated the others that made the unity irrelevant.
Yeah, okay. You know? That's a good point. Yes, that's a very good point. If there was...
And maybe that magical force isn't around anymore. That sword is lost. The dragons are dead, on and on. So we need the realm of men to come together unified. Otherwise, you won't be able to defeat the others like we did before because we don't have that same magic power.
Good said, Sean, because we can't be assuming all the same pieces are in place. There's a lot of differences. You know, George isn't doing a one-to-one relationship here. He's giving us similarities, not exact history repeating itself. When history repeats itself, it's not meant to be an exact repetition, although I guess sometimes it's pretty darn close. But generally, it's more of like similar patterns. Like fashion is cyclical. But even when something comes back that has been out for 20 years, it's not exactly the same as it was in the 2000s as it is in 2023, you know? There's some modernization added to it, little tweaks here and there. Same goes for much larger scale things like war against an implacable, icy enemy. So there were people, even though they didn't bend the knee, there were like, well, let's negotiate. I'm not going to bend the knee, but we could be allies, right? Of course, Aegon would say no to this, but the offers came. So let's look at that briefly. We talked about last week the marriage offers. There were several offers to be Aegon's third wife. So some of those actually haven't happened yet, but we don't need to review those a second time. This is an example of this, of the alliances. Princess Maria offers to help fight Argilac the Arrogant. She's like, well, I'll team up with you against him. I won't bend the knee to you, but I'm glad to do a pincer move. He's between us. And Queen Regent Shara, in addition to her offer of marrying Aegon, she also offers to team up against King Harren. Same thing, sandwich move. There's Vale to the north, Dragonstone to the south. They've got King Harren kind of in a pincer there. But of course, he's not like that. He's not up to that either. He's like, no, I'm not. No equals here. Plenty were willing to be equals. Plenty were willing to see him as equals, which to them might be like they're making a concession. Like, he's not a king. I'm a king. Who's he? You know, me offering an equal alliance with him, he should be satisfied with that because I'm already a higher rank. I've got a whole kingdom. My family's been here for thousands of years in place of this. He has hardly any troops. Who the heck is he? So some of them were like, well, he does have the dragons and the Velaryon. So yeah, we'll give him this equality in negotiations.
And Harren sucks.
Yeah.
Like, we have this common enemy.
That's right. So there's all these factors that would lead them to think, okay, well, we've got some negotiating wiggle room here. Let's try to. We understand him presenting himself this way. This is probably what we would do. We would probably puff ourselves up. Maybe he's asking for a lot and willing to accept less. He wasn't, but it's a reasonable way to interpret his message, I think. Nina says that this.
And it's.
Go ahead.
Just, we've said this before, we'll probably say it again, but when they offer to team up, and he's like, no, I can do it myself. And then he does it himself. And then he turns to, now you're next. You know, like,
I should have teamed up. I should have bent the knee, maybe.
Yeah.
No, they can't say that out loud. You know, like, as you said, they have to project strength and pride. They can't act weak in front of their vassals. But inside, they're like, damn, I chose wrong, didn't I? So Nina says it's a sign that at this early stage, the established dynasties of Westeros were treating the Targaryens as no more than new players in what Stephen Atwell, shout out to Race for the Iron Throne, by the way, calls the Great Game. That is the scramble for power and dominion in pre-conquest Westeros. Remember that this was not the first time a Westeros king had tried to create a large empire on the continent. The Gardner Kingdom under Giles III stretched from Red Lake in the north to Sun House in the south, and from the Shield Islands in the west to the Narrow Sea, and possibly even Tarth in the east. So that's huge. I mean, that's like most of southern Westeros minus Dorne, but a lot of the northern part of the continent, not the north, but the northern part of the area south of the north.
Worth noting that the southern part of the continent is like the relevant part of the continent, like the fertile land, the higher population. You know, it's when you if you divide the land up into north and south. If you could choose which one you want to be the ruler of, you choose the South.
Yeah, definitely. And another example Nina gives us is Arlen III, Durrandon Kingdom, one of the Storm Kings. His kingdom stretched from the Neck in the north through the Dornish Marches in the south, and from Ironman's Bay all the way to the west of the Narrow Sea in the east. All the way west of the Narrow Sea in the east, rather. But the central rule of the Great Game was that no one could win permanently. Great Game is capitalized, by the way. Just as the Gardner Kingdom was eventually hacked away by various kings in the west, Riverlands and Dorne, you couldn't defend it all, and the other kings took advantage of the size of this new realm to take advantage of the fact that you can't defend all that. Like, you can't be everywhere at once. You can't have border defenses everywhere. It's too large of a border. There's not a lot of natural defenses. there, which is why the borders often reset to their sort of quote-unquote natural ones, because those borders are somewhat reinforced by geography. So once you move beyond the geography, you no longer rely on those natural defenses. You have to use manpower. And the larger your realm gets, the more manpower you need to defend that against these other kings and queens who are quite capable of carving those chunks back off and maybe taking some of yours in the process. So there's several examples here of large kingdoms that just didn't hold. And that might be what some of these kings saw. They'd be like, okay, well, maybe Aegon will be able to carve off a lot of this chunk, but he'll never be able to hold it all, especially not the whole kingdom. No one's ever done that. No one's even come close to that. Even these large kingdoms that we've described, at most were 60%. I don't even think that. I'm not sure anyone ever ruled more than half the kingdom at once. They'd have to do a little math and detail gathering on that one. But let's just call it roughly that. And so this guy's going for all of it? Yeah, that's... It just goes to show what a boss move it is to say, I don't have equals, nor do I require help, and I'm doing something no one's even come close to doing before, or even tried, really. So you can understand why there was a lot of just, there's no way. I don't care how big that dragon is. It's just not happening. It just seems so ridiculous. 8,000 years like this. And, you could say that, well, the kingdoms have been getting smaller and smaller. I mean, the number of kingdoms has gotten smaller and smaller. Maybe eventually, historically speaking, it just makes sense that it would all come into one. But this is pretty quick. It maybe would have taken more of a gradual scenario than just all at once, all 7 of them united. But hey, this was a different kind of leader. There's a lot of establishment of symbols here. There's the crown that he's eventually going to have when he lands. So that's a pretty big deal. And the sword Blackfire is a bit of a symbol, much more of a symbol later. But for now, it's more about the dragons. And I guess the biggest one is they unfurled that big dragon banner. There's a quote for that later, I think we have. But the point is that they weren't doing Westerosi cultural things. Like, apparently Aegon was the first of his family to have a Andal oriented banner with words and a house motto and all that. Like, the Targaryens apparently just didn't do that for the first 90 years on Dragonstone, or however long it was. So this was part of adopting the culture that they were planning to rule. Not only does he adopt the 7, but he adopts this particular cultural tradition, probably several others as well. Maybe, things like knighthood and other things. I'm not sure how much they had embraced that. Certainly a lot of their followers would have been knighted, but Aegon himself, I don't think was ever knighted. And a lot of his descendants would be, but I doubt any of his forebears were. So that's another thing that as part of the setup, he did that. Now, so when we talk about him planning the conquest, these are the kind of plans he made. It's not about his troops as much, or making sure they have the right weaponry. I mean, I'm sure there was some of that going on, but his troops were such a small aspect to this. He had so few of them at this point. It's like Stannis again. That's why it fits with Stannis so well. Stannis, when he's going north to the wall, he's only got like 1,500 men left. It's probably about how many Aegon has here, except he's not going north. He's going to the mouth of the Blackwater. So there's a lot of these cultural preparation, adopting the 7, adopting knighthood, adopting a banner, adopting house words. I guess that was probably an easy one. What are we going to do for our house words? Fire and blood, man. That's easy. Like, oh yeah, that is easy. All right, fire and blood. Cool. It does kind of fit naturally, I think. And it may have been enhanced by dreams, or not necessarily even dreams about the others. Just a lot of Targaryens have had dreams described that way, I think. It's fiery, bloody dreams. Seems common. Maybe more fire than blood, but still a lot of both.
Coming out of the Doom, too, would maybe echoes of that in their history.
So I want to emphasize a bit just how proud of themselves all these kingdoms were, these kings and kingdoms and their families that support that. They're very full of themselves, and they'd outlasted so many others. So many of these other, on one, you could look back at how it had become 7 kingdoms and say, it used to be 100 kingdoms, it used to be 1,000 kingdoms, and our family emerged at the top of that heap after all this fog of history and violence. We're standing tall in a land where so many have died trying. So that's another, from what you were saying before, Sean, of course they're just not going to give up on that. It's one thing to be proud of your ancestry. It's another to fool yourself into thinking that you're responsible, as in responsible for creating any of that. You inherited it, and maybe you've managed it well, but you didn't build it, right? To be fair, each successive generation has a larger history to protect. Their legacy gets larger and more, something to be more proud of. And their society puts a lot of pressure on them to protect that and preserve that. So, yeah, it's a very deeply held cultural belief, one that they would not let go of too easily.
You could say as much pride as there is, there's also a sense of responsibility, ostensibly,
Absolutely.
with a good leader,
Yes, definitely. And that's not a bad thing. Well, no, this guy wants to come conquer us. No, of course, it's my job to defend us from that. I'm going to do it. So yeah, it's not like a bad thing that they didn't bend the knee. If they knew about the supernatural future, that's maybe, but there's no way they could know that. There's no way to even convince them of that. Like, why would they believe this crazy guy talking about, like, in a couple hundred years or so, there's going to be, it's like, so we all need to prepare now, like, so your grandchildren's 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 grandchildren will be prepared for it. Like, what the hell is he talking about?
Like, in modern times, how much do we do to prepare for 200 years from now?
Not a lot.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, we have way more knowledge and access to knowledge. We have way better infrastructure, ostensibly better leaders. I don't know. And yet still, we are not thinking past maybe 2 generations,
We are not. You're right. And some people do, but they can't convince the rest of us to go along with it. And there is a greater emphasis on that in society these days, but maybe not much greater progress in terms of actually doing that. Because it's not something like, without technology, you wouldn't have thought of thinking ahead that far in ancient times. Like, why would you? What reason would you have? You're not thinking about, like, oh, look at what deforestation will cause. I don't know if the ancients would have realized that. Maybe they would have. And maybe
they weren't able to deforest as fast.
Right?
For one.
They didn't know the consequences. Yeah. And they're like, ooh, we shouldn't have done that. But they may not have even known what.
And when you have less resources, it makes more sense to worry about your children, yourself first, your children next. When you start to get more and more resources, then you worry about your neighbors and your grandchildren.
Good point.
And so people of Westeros, compared to most people in the modern world, have way more wealth and stability. Food, you're not as worried about food. But back then, most of the hours of most of the people is spent trying to not starve. That's the main endeavor of everyone's life, is to just create food. So it makes sense that they're not all worried about something 200 years ago.
Yeah. They're like the present is demanding enough. Like, who's going to worry about the future?
They're worrying about the harvest in a couple months. Yeah. That's what dominates their lives.
Yeah, you can't look ahead when the present is that demanding, I think. Yeah. So, what do you think, Sean? Do you think Aegon expected any of them to bend the knee, or do you think their reaction was pretty much what he expects? Like, yeah, none of them are actually going to bend the knee, but I need to make the claim and start off this way and set that target and prove that I can hit it.
Yeah, I think that he expected them to bend the knee after a couple battles, after he made it clear, look, you can't beat me, sorry. And not only can you not beat me, but I'm not that bad also. I think that was part of it too. He wasn't just ruthlessly, unnecessarily slaughtering people, right?
Right.
He wasn't just burning down random villages. He was only doing it in battle, and he started with the worst leader. So I'm confident that he did expect at least some of them to bend the knee after the first couple were conquered. I think he might have expected or hoped for, and might have gotten, we don't necessarily know it, some negotiation. He might have got a few people say, like, look, I can't just randomly bend the knee, but if you show up with 5,000 troops and 2 dragons, I'll make a show of force, and then my people will see I'm being reasonable by bending the knee to you. I think that he might have expected or hoped or even gotten that. So.
It's a chance for them to show their bravery, in a sense. It's almost like, well, if I can survive this battle, I'll look really brave. I'll look like I did my duty. But ultimately, I plan to surrender. We can't surrender before there's any fighting. Then I'm going to look like a coward. And that, and that's just one of the worst things you can look like in Westeros when you're in charge.
And that's even better for Aegon too. If
he doesn't want cowards following him.
Right. If the person that bends the knee to him, he then puts them in charge of the land that they're already in charge of. They should do a decent job, right?
Yeah.
But if that person now looks like a coward to his people, it won't be stable. That'll be
Yeah.
a problem for Aegon. So he wants them to be able to still look good at the end of the battle or the knee bending or whatever happens.
Yeah, he wants them to still look good because they'll look good under him rather than like it's he's only as good as his subordinates. So that's a great point as well, Sean, because he doesn't want to be surrounded by weaklings, and the strong people come along later and go, he only conquered the realm because everyone bent the knee. Like, no one ever gave him a fight. Let's give him a fight and see what happens. But Aegon was determined to make sure that if there were fights, he won them handily, so that people would be like, we're not even gonna try.
Even in a scenario like that where someone thinks that their ruler is a coward and we could have beat the Targaryens, and so there's a civil war. And Aegon can go and burn them all down with his dragons. But then what? It's just so much worse.
Yeah.
Right? It's so much worse to have the destruction that civil war would cause, the destruction that he will have to commit to stop the civil war. And then what happens now? Who's in charge? Like the people who were in charge before that you could trust to run it, they're all dead.
Yeah.
The next strongest, bravest people who are trying to fight them, well, they're all dead. So now you got to pick someone, and it'll be this constant issue. So
yeah, good said. So as far as the dragons too, I know we touched on this briefly last time, but Nina added a point here. The dragons aren't an automatic win button, and especially from the perspective of these kings and queens who haven't seen them in action. They don't know exactly what they're capable of. So you have to put that to the test. For all they know, the dragons won't go where you want them to. For all you know, the dragons will turn on their own troops sometimes. Now, that's not what will happen. But they don't know that. Like, can they really control them that well? There's things they can say to themselves to maybe pump themselves up. And this goes for the lords and the common men. Once the dragons are in action and once it's been seen what they can do, especially Balerion, that's when people start to go, okay, you've proven what they can do. It's more than we thought. Now we'll definitely consider bending the knee. Like Torrhen. That's pretty much exactly the case of Torrhen. Dragons are useful and powerful tools, no question, but they don't replace strategy, so I have to use them properly. And as we said, there's a little something to be said about Balerion's enormous size that may have given Aegon a weapon that no one else before him really had. It's entirely possible Balerion was the largest dragon in the history of House Targaryen. Maybe one of the largest would have been one of the largest seen in Valyria. And here's a point from our episode in Balerion that I want to remind you all of. I think I've maybe said it a couple times before, but it bears repeating here. Vhagar, Meraxes, and Balerion are named after Valyrian gods. Vhagar and Meraxes were named after Valyrian gods after all the dragons were wiped out. So that's like, it's not as, you're not naming you're not elevating one dragon to the status of a god name when there's hundreds of them. Right? But Balerion was born in Valyria when there were hundreds of dragons and got the name of a Valyrian god. How many dragons got the name of Valyrian gods when there were hundreds of them? How many Valyrian gods are there? Were there like dozens of dragons named Balerion? Were there lots of other Vhagars and Meraxes?
Fido.
Yeah, Fido. Fidax. It's F-Y-D-O. Yeah.
The X is silent.
Yeah. So that says something. Like, I don't know how they knew. I mean, okay, let me use our black cat, Jaqen, as an example, because when we saw this kitten, it was clear this kitten would be huge as a cat. He already had huge paws. He already had huge ears, huge whiskers. Like, he was going to grow into that. So I wonder if it was a little bit like this with Balerion. This dragon hatch, and like, that is a huge hatchling. That's a fat baby. The equivalent of that for a human. And indeed, turned into an unusually enormously large dragon. And that might have been, I always think that's a big part of the calculus here that's maybe kind of underrated. Just the pure size of Balerion changed the calculus of everything. And another thing Nina adds is the dragons have been sitting there for a century. If they could have conquered. Now, we've come up with lots of reasons why they wouldn't conquer. And there's plenty, right? But it's not the same logic that these kings and queens might use when considering that same question. They'd be like, well, if they could have done it before, why didn't they? It's just a reason for them to pump up their pride, especially because they know they're not going to back down. They know they have to put this to the test. So they may as well pump themselves up with some reasoning to be like, well, why might this go well? Well, yeah, maybe they don't, maybe they're bluffing a bit. So they would maybe be able to talk themselves into some things, knowing that they're going to be doing it anyway. It's one thing to convince yourself of something that's not true before you've decided what to do. But if you're already convinced you're going into this fight, there's nothing wrong with some false bravado, you know? It's like that Slim Charles line from The Wire that I've quoted before. If we're going to fight on that lie. Don't break their morale by telling them that the reason they're fighting is a lie. Go ahead and let that inspire them. If you're going to fight anyway, it doesn't matter. Inspiration
It's
is
better
inspiration.
to not fight, but if you're going to,
Yes.
at least keep morale up.
Yes, yes. Don't undermine your troops with truth. There's a time for everything, right? I mean, that's a true. That's a real thing, right? We've used that example before. You don't just go around telling kids that certain beings don't. I won't name it by certain holiday individuals don't actually exist, right? That's not cool. So yeah, it's just an extension of that in a way. Shay thinks it's very cool. Maegor the Cool. Mm-hmm.
I love ruining children's days.
It's a good thing you're muted for that statement.
Shea said she likes ruining children's days? Really? Oh, for shame. So, despite how dominant Balerion would prove to be, not to mention Vhagar and Meraxes, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to attack all the 7 kingdoms at the same time. So he had the choice of who to target first, and it seems like he went with prison rules of sorts. What I'm referring to is relating to the idea of demonstrating the power of the dragons. You go fight the strongest person, and then no one messes with you, because you've already, if you're not the weakest person in the room, you won't be the first one picked on. It's like the old rules of poker. If you can't spot the sucker at the table, it's probably you. So by that same logic, it makes more sense to target the biggest bully, assuming you have the ability to actually pull it off. Because if you fail, then, well, that kind of backfired, didn't it? So here we go. Quote.
North of the Blackwater, the Riverlands were ruled by the bloody hand of Harren the Black of House Horror, king of the Isles and the Rivers. Harren's ironborn grandsire, Harwin Hardhand, had taken the trident from Argilac's grandsire, Eric, whose own forebears had thrown down the last of the River Kings centuries earlier. Harren's father had extended his domains east to Duskendale and Rosby. Harren himself had devoted most of his long reign, close on 40 years, to building a gigantic castle beside the God's Eye, but with Harrenhal at last nearing completion, the Ironborn would soon be free to seek fresh conquests. No king in Westeros was more feared than Black Harren, whose cruelty had become legendary all through the 7 kingdoms.
Shea is going to pull up a map here to remind us just how large Harren's kingdom was. He basically controlled the entire center of Westeros, all the way from roughly where, not exactly where King's Landing is, but Maidenpool, all the Riverlands. And where the Riverlands ends is a little spotty, but it's roughly a little past Maidenpool to the east. But everything northwest of that, all the way to the Iron Islands. So what you're looking at is, how does anyone trade with the Vale or the North when the Riverlands is controlled by this guy? Well, he would probably tax that stuff pretty heavily. So it's another example of his bullying, like economic bullying or dominance, that may go unnoticed by a lot of readers or analysts. So this would be not just his breaking Harren would not just end his threat, which is substantial, but it would open up a lot of trade and commercial ventures for folks who would have been stymied. And the Riverlands is known for trade. I mean, the rivers themselves create a lot of opportunity for boats going back and forth rapidly into a lot of different places, somewhat remote to somewhat central. So it's a very good place for that, but it's been dominated by a tyrant who, rather than build on that natural prosperity, he exploits it to build this giant, awful castle that involves basically enslaving people, working them to death, stripping lots of regions of their natural resources, kind of maybe the equivalent of like strip mining and deforesting, including cutting down weirwoods, which, you know, wouldn't bother the followers of the 7 all that much, but might make a few people nervous about what the old gods might do. some superstitions linger. A lot of people still respect the old gods, even if their main prayer is to the new gods. That's why they say that the old gods of the new. That people still say that phrase because it still matters.
Even if you're Christian or Jewish or whatever, you don't want all the old Greek pantheons destroyed because they're not your religion.
Yeah.
You know, if someone just starts wreaking havoc on ancient sacred ground, everyone's a little aghast, even if you're not specifically connected to it.
You know that
So
means
what
a lot
next
to someone.
kind of idea.
Yeah. Or the first
Right.
day, first they came for their religious landmarks. Next they'll come for ours. Yeah, it's not hard to connect that dot. I totally agree. So, given the size of Harren's castle and of his realm and how unpopular he was, the religious aspects as well. I mean, he's foisting the drowned god religion here. He's not a worshiper of the Seven. He's not like a very religious guy, but certainly wasn't following the Seven.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a problem. Yet another reason why Aegon adopting the Seven was a really smooth political move. Not only is it the dominant majority religion, but it was very opposed to what Harren was doing. So it just really fits in line with this plan of attacking Harren first, to adopt the religion of people that really hate this guy. Much easier to recruit them, much easier to win them over. Yeah, taking down a tyrant, people will sign up for that, including people within his own realm. And I bet he predicted that. So this issue of timing is very interesting. Legend tells us that Aegon's landing occurred on the same day that Harrenhal was declared complete. I don't know if it was the exact same day. That seems like a little bit of, just storytelling.
Adding to the myth.
Yeah. A little myth making there. But it's cool. The point being, though, it was pretty close together, which that's enough to make the point. It doesn't have to be the exact same day for it to be.
By the way, I can believe it's the same day because once again, I think Aegon had a lot of logistical planning behind this. I think he understood
he may have spied on them to
of,
find out what day it was going to be over,
yeah.
declared done. Just like, it would have been a big event. He's like celebrating the day the castle was completed, and Aegon could have known about that. Stealing his thunder. I like that. That's a great call. Yeah.
Again, like I think that he understands the symbolic nature of what he's doing and his actions, going after Harren first in the first place. I think that I don't think it would have been like some secret that no one could possibly know. The more I think about it, the more I think it probably was. It probably was calculated specifically for that day.
I like it. Yeah, I was a little skeptical, but you guys have made some really good points there. I think I might have to change my mind because of the symbolic relevance of it. If he thought of that, it seems like he probably would have, then he would plan for that, and it makes a lot of sense. It's like starting a holiday on an existing holiday to kind of erase it, which has happened before.
Like when you think about it, he probably could have done whatever he's doing 2 months sooner.
Yeah.
2 months later. But he chose this day. I think he chose this day very specifically.
Yeah, I think you guys are right about that. And because if he started a few days early, like it wouldn't matter. It's like Harrenhal. It's like, oh no, Harrenhal's complete now. Now Balerion can't melt it. It's like, oh, you missed your chance. It's like Star Wars. That thing's operational. Like it was still very effective as a castle before that final brick was put in. It's like, oh, now it all works. Now it's turned the whole castle on. Now, like the switch works. Harrenhal isn't firing the big blast of super hot plasma, though. That's Balerion. The castle isn't the Death Star. Balerion's the Death Star, right? So these are things that, like you said, Aegon in his brain trust would have figured out and realized the value of stealing his thunder. And Harren, I wonder what he knew. Like, we can see that Aegon was probably keeping track of what was going on. Was Harren keeping track of Aegon? I don't know. Probably not. He's probably too arrogant for that. Probably didn't think they mattered.
Yeah.
What's that little island? What do I care about that one island? One day they'll be mine, or my sons will rule them someday. That's probably more on the lines of his thinking. He probably was that arrogant. Not. It's certainly his later and earlier actions do imply that. As arrogant as Argilac, perhaps Harrenhal needed. They should have fought over that nickname. No, I'm more arrogant. Maybe he did some common sense things like buy a few more crossbows, but they didn't know like truly how to fight dragons. Maybe if there was a way to if he had some Valyrian text that showed what dragons did to each other, maybe. But scorpions, that's what they needed, were the scorpions and the big bolt throwers. But I don't know if he knew about that. If he did,
even that might have just like slowed it down a little.
Yeah.
Aegon has to be a little more careful, but it doesn't win the battle.
No,
I
and
don't
as we
think.
saw,
Yeah.
he when he does attack, which we'll get to later, he does it at night when it's really hard to find shoot him. Like, where is he? You know, it's dark. You only ever see it when the fire starts shooting out of his mouth, and then it's like, well, where exactly is he in that? You know, and yeah, just. Nina says there's also a point to make here about timing with respect to both ideology and power. If Aegon really did decide to invade just at the moment Harrenhal was completed, then he was attacking Harrenhal at the point where both native Riverlands' resentment against the Whores was at its peak, while native Riverlands' power and resources were at their nadir. Also, it goes to that strength thing. He's like, I'm not going to attack you before you're ready. I'm going to wait till you're ready and then knock you down so everyone knows that, you know, you were ready for me, and I still beat you. Your castle was done. You declared it so. And I still beat you. And I still melted it, you know? Like all that preparation. So, yeah. Nina says Harren had effectively enslaved the native population of Riverlands to build a monument to his own absolute authority, the most crushing symbol of their lack of political identity in a system which considered them subhuman compared to the Ironborn. It's kind of hard to think of that. Like, the Ironborn are now, like, laughed at and thought of as a backwards people. But at this point, they were at this was a high point at this point. And you couldn't look down on the Ironborn in the same way. You might look down on them culturally, but you couldn't look down on them as a power. Like, they are not a backwater reduced to the Iron Islands situation here. They are arguably peaking. And people didn't know that this would be their peak. They thought it might go higher. They didn't know that Aegon would set the whole peak afire and melt it down to nothing. So yeah, Riverland's resentment would have also been peaking, and Aegon was counting on that, and it worked. At the same time, however, Riverland's resources were also at their most depleted, however, because every year he was demanding more and more, and it's not like it gets easier to find stone and trees when you're cutting down so many and killing so many people in the mines and overworking them to death. You start to run thin of these things. So the Riverlands was weaker.
That's the thing. Military investments, it could be complicated, but as a default, a military investment, it doesn't produce new stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you tax the people and you know, enslave the population in order to build more farms, well, after that, you have more food. And, you know, maybe that's not the best way to do it, but something got produced. But if you enslave the people and pillage the land to build a big castle, okay, well, now you got a big castle. No one's fed because you have a big castle. There's not any extra wood that's generated for the people or anything. So,
right on. Next up, let's talk about. Oops. Aegon wasn't ready to introduce the biggest bully in Westeros to Balerion, the biggest dragon in the world, just yet. He had the plan, but as we said, there were some things he had to do first. He announced a claim before a lot of the preparations were made, and that's probably in part because of what we just sort of sussed out with the fact that he wanted to time things for Harren's completion, and maybe that didn't give him enough time to do some of those other things first. Like, well, this is the date we're working around, so we got to get our claim forward, and then start moving our troops, and then all this other stuff. So, let's take a few questions, and then we'll come back with the beginning of the actual landing. Julie A., I wonder if Balerion was especially bred in Valyria, or if he just had a super large egg. Oh, those are cool possibilities.
You're muted, Shay.
Thanks, Sean. And then there was a continuation of that where Dornish Dame added on to that and said, ooh, that dragon breeding idea is interesting, at Julia A. Not something I'd thought of before, but if Valyrians were as advanced as we're told, surely they would have bred dragons as Westerosi do horses. So comparing it to horse breeding. And then Christina K. replied and said, I have a headcanon that the Targaryens got to be noble by being like really good dragon breeders. Like a specialty, you know? Like,
wow, yes.
Just because they weren't like a particularly, they weren't like the most respected of the Valyrian houses, so which makes it seem like they were more of a stewardly class, more of like the Tyrells to the Hightowers kind of classes,
or maybe like the Cleganes, right?
Yeah, or that, or like the Clegane dog breeder kind of thing. Yes, that is a better comparison.
Something that wouldn't be thought of is noble, something you wouldn't be proud of, something like common people do. But it might be unique and special enough, and they were good enough at it,
It's protected too. The
yeah.
secrets you need to. There's a
Yeah.
lot of secrets behind it. Whereas with horsemanship, I don't know if you're as worried about people finding out some things. You still would, because you like horse superiority is a thing, and there's been plenty of
Yeah.
times where ancient armies have clashed, and the superiority of horses has been the difference. Like one group's horses are way bigger and stronger, and that makes a massive difference. Like we look at horses now, war horses. Like look back in like early medieval times, those horses were small. People didn't fight from horseback. They would ride to the battle, then get off the horse and then fight, because the horse wasn't really that well equipped for it. It couldn't handle all this armor and let alone a rider wearing armor and all this weaponry. But it took a lot of breeding to get to that point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Dragons may very well fall
It's
under
also-
the same umbrella.
It's also the type of thing, if you think about it a little, and there's all kinds of research you can do on it, but there is a lot of difference in types of horses. Like some are bred to be bigger and stronger to like haul more weight, but some are bred to be more nimble and to get up and down like mountains and cliffs and uneven terrain. Some
Yeah.
are built for endurance to travel
Sand
just a
steeds.
long way,
Yes.
on and on. And so yeah, you can imagine both in general, like or in the real world or whatever, if you have some horses that are big and strong and they have these mounted knights on them coming forward with lances, but you're on uneven rocky terrain with a river to cross, and these other horses have just like bareback riders, like on our Native Americans or something, and they're quick and nimble and can cut really fast, they might just run circles around the heavy armored horses. But if they both had the same types of horses and one is trained for one thing and the other, anyway, it wouldn't work as well. You could easily see that with dragons. You could easily see some dragons you might want to fly a longer distance, to have hotter breath, to be tougher skinned. You could see all these different traits that might be bred. And if the Targaryens made Balerion, right?
Yeah, they'd be like, ooh, that one worked out really well.
The other houses might have been like, all right, fine, you can be noble, I guess. You're making better dragons than our dragons. So.
I do like the idea of besides the breeding, the really large egg. Those two ideas go together. If you're raising your dragon well, then it might produce abnormally large eggs, or maybe there's something you can do to the egg after it's laid to make it stronger.
I know what you could do.
What?
Sit on it.
Sit on it.
I've seen it in all the tales.
That's right.
Yeah, maybe if they're incubated at a certain temperature for a certain time, or within a certain magical realm, a certain vicinity to a certain mountaintop or whatever.
If you have Daemon Targaryen singing to them, perhaps,
Yeah.
I do think about things like the singing and stuff like that, and the things Daemon was kind of looking into, that he might just be tapping into his Targaryen roots, that he doesn't realize how much his family was really into that.
Maybe he did read some random book that Viserys threw at him when they were 9 years old or something,
That's funny, yeah. Did I ever mention the example of the Comanche and the Apaches with regard to horses?
I don't think so.
So shout out to the channel Dates and Dead Guys on YouTube, which is a name that fits so well with the Song of Ice and Fire naming conventions, because it reminds me of this horse discussion we're having that relates to dragons. In like the 1840s, so not that long ago, we're talking about horses and horse superiority mattering in ancient times. It mattered 180 years ago as well. It's not that long in the past. What happened with
the United States Army still had horse cavalry in World War One.
Yeah, World War
Still
One, yeah.
riding into battle in World
and
War One,
not
with
just the
horses.
U.S. Like the Germans had it too, I
Yeah.
believe.
Well, I point out the U.S. because we were relatively modern compared to the other
Okay,
countries. Like we had, we were making airplanes and stuff like that, but still had horses.
And it's weird,
So-
they're shipping horses overseas to fight World War One when there's planes and battleships,
machine guns. and-
yeah, it's a little
we
wild.
use planes and tanks also,
Yeah.
but the point is, horses were still a part of modern warfare 100 years ago, not ancient times.
Yeah. So the example was that the Spanish, of course, for a long time, obviously controlled a lot of what's now the United States, and they brought over their super well-bred Mustang horses. At one point, a large number of Mustang horses were lost, and they were taken by a group of Apache that became the Comanche, or maybe they were already the Comanche. I forget what happened, what that part of it. Don't quote me on that part. But the Comanche became like the Ironborn / Dothraki of that period, because they were raiders. They were really good at it. They knew the terrain better than anyone. You would never chase after them. because you would get counter ambushed, and you couldn't chase after them because their horses were faster. So they would strike out of nowhere and get away out of nowhere, and you could never chase them. So that's like the nature of raiding. And this was because they had these Spanish-bred horses, where the horses native to the U.S. and, well, there's no horses native to the U.S. The horses that had started over there were nothing like these exceptional, top-of-the-line European war horses that once the Comanche got a hold of them, their advantage was just overwhelming to all the other tribes in their area, as well as against the U.S. When the U.S. came along and was fighting, they were like, damn, this tribe has incredible horses. Crap, where did they get these? And they're like, well, from the Spanish. That's where they got them.
Yeah. And I wish I knew a little better, but I can imagine the Mustangs maybe were bred for maneuverability and quickness and not power and strength. And so a lot of the horses coming across from the east to the west were the big, strong ones hauling carts.
Yeah.
They're not fast and nimble. So.
Well, the Comanche also knew a lot about horse breeding. By that time, they had learned, because horses had been in America for a long time. So they took those horses and then trained them a little differently and bred them a little differently, a little more suited to their needs than what the Spanish, but similar. But what you're saying is still true. Just they branched off into an all new direction for their own needs. A couple other notes here. Matt Reese points out a small error I made in my description of the Persians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians. It wasn't the Assyrians that Cyrus the Great overthrew. It was the Medes. The Assyrians had taken Babylon, the Medes took it from them, and then the Persians took it from the Medes. So ultimately my example was, the point I got across was still accurate, but I want to be historically accurate. So thanks for the correction there, Matt Reese. Several people pointed out that we had a little feet yards goof last week when you talked about the painted table being 50 foot long. You're like, that's half a football field. Like, no, that's 50 yards, which is 3 times longer. So whoops.
I feel similarly, though, that I might have been off on the detail of the yards versus feet, but it's still preposterous. A 50-foot table is also still crazy.
It is extreme, but not crazy, not preposterous, because we certainly had people link us to examples in the Facebook group and whatnot of 50 feet, 40 feet tables that are around today.
But not 150 feet.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily need a soccer stadium to house them, but you still can't really. Again, think of the idea of looking at the map. You're on one end of the table looking at Dorne. You cannot see the wall. You cannot even see King's Landing. It's too far away across the table.
That's how he stayed fit, okay? Because he had to walk around the table. He did that.
Jog around the table.
Around the table.
Run all the way over here. It's like I'm out of breath running from over here. It's like, check out over here. All right, hold on. Okay, look over here.
But no, 50 feet, very possible. Definitely unwieldy. Impressive, all that, but possible for sure. 50 yards, as I definitely also was imagining, not very possible. Very difficult.
Christina Kay made a great point last week about how George uses mysteries. He presents them in a variety of ways. One of the ways he does it is that he doesn't tell us it's a mystery. Or he tells us it's a resolved mystery, but it isn't. It's falsely resolved, like the issue of maybe John's parentage, which a lot of people in world think they have the answer. And the only reason, but we have to ask ourselves we have to realize it's a mystery. Because people in the book aren't sitting there wondering, who is John's dad? John isn't wondering, or mom. John's not, or both. John's not wondering that. Well, he is about his mom. But only at the beginning. He doesn't really think about it later. Maybe only once at most. So, but Nina expands on that idea. It's like George does this a lot of different ways. That's one of them. But sometimes he does have them ask. Sometimes they're very deep in the mystery themselves, like John, or like Ned trying to figure out who killed John Arryn, or Ned trying to figure, or the pink letters one that the fandom invented as a mystery. That isn't necessarily one that was intended to be, but that's just that works out as an example here too. Just something that becomes a mystery because of the way we see it versus what people in world see it as. Like the identity of young Griff. Tyrion does question it. Only a little bit, but he does question it. So that is an example of, like, if someone had sat there and go, I don't know about Jon. I don't know. I don't think Ned's his dad. If someone had that thought, which no one has had, not even Ned, not Jon, then that mystery would be framed a lot differently. But so George is not going to that same playbook every time. He uses a variety of ways to frame mysteries, and that keeps us on our toes. Like, well, this pattern, this is not the same pattern being followed here. He's just really good at it. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, sometimes even in the real world, even something that is known, there is still a reason to question it, right?
Yes.
Maybe there's some bias involved or some piece that doesn't add up. And so that would happen in George's world too. Like even something that is factual, there would still be some people that have reason to question it. And so that gives the audience a reason to question. And sometimes you question it, and the audience even can have a better perspective because we're reading different people's perspective. We can have knowledge that one character doesn't have another, but the audience doesn't always have all the knowledge either, obviously. So that, like you said, there's a lot of different ways for him to come at us with these mysteries.
Like another good example is who's the Harpy. Like we're wondering who the Harpy is, so are the characters. We're all kind of together on that, and we kind of have the same information. So, but that's completely different than the Jon Snow example, So that's neat. Guinevere Greenstones asks, should we be reading Fire and Blood with Aegon's dream in mind? Now, we briefly clarified this at the beginning of the first episode, but let's clarify it further. I think yes, but I think it's a year mileage may vary thing. I think if you've already read Fire and Blood without it in mind, which you probably haven't, or probably have read it without it in mind, why not read it with it in mind this time? It'll feel a little different. It'll come off a little different. Most of the information's the same, but it's a little different look at a book that you've already read. So I think it's fun to read it with that in mind. You don't have to take it as canon because technically, yes, George has said it probably applies to the books. Well, he didn't say it probably applies to the books. The way he's framed it, it almost certainly applies to the books, but not necessarily the same way it applies to the show. Like his take on it might be different than the way we were presented in the show. So there's definitely some wiggle room as to what George exactly intends for Aegon's dream to have been. We have to keep that in mind. But personally, absolutely yes, we're keeping it in mind. I think it's more fun to do that, but we have to be careful with reading too much into it and and not taking the show too directly in its interpretation. Just as the show is like a guideline for us, I think.
This is, another angle to take. Should you read a Game of Thrones with a Clash of King in mind? Like if you've read them all and you're rereading it, I think you should,
yes.
Right? George didn't necessarily have everything and that he ended up writing in A Dance with Dragons. He didn't have all that set in his brain when he started reading Game of Thrones.
That's true.
But he kept Game of Thrones in mind when he wrote Dance of Dragons.
He wants those dots to connect still,
Right. So I think when he wrote Fire and Blood, he wanted all the things to add up with what he had written so far. When he makes a statement to the world about, hey, there's this prophecy that Aegon had, I think that he is keeping it all tied together. I don't think he's just saying it willy-nilly. I think he intends, he wants at least for it to all jive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's probably thought and made sure that it does. Even if he didn't exactly have the intention in the first place, I still think it's worth us at least accounting for it.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about his writing style. I think that's just briefly, I think that fits really well here. For example, there's one part from the books that people cite as something George set up way in advance. But no, he didn't actually. He realized it would fit later. And then what I'm talking about is when Sansa thinks about Janos Slynt that she wishes some hero would throw him down and cut his head off. And then Jon Snow does that later. But people point out that in the original draft of A Dance with Dragons, he's hanged, not had his head cut off. So George didn't plan all the way back in the Clash of Kings for Jon to cut his head off. But, which is true, George didn't plan all the way back in the Clash of Kings for Jon to cut his head off. Probably not. But there's a couple possibilities here. Maybe he did and forgot about it and then later realized, like, oh yeah, actually I was going to have Jon cut his head off because of that line I made back in Clash of Kings. Maybe he just forgot that in editing. He realized, oh yeah, I was going to do that. Or, perhaps more likely, he realized he could fit it to that point he made back then. He's like, oh, I can connect this to what Sansa said back then by making this a head chopping instead of a hanging. And that's totally valid because of the way George writes in his Gardner style. He leaves room for this. It's one of the reasons the dots connect so well is he doesn't write himself into corners. He leaves this option to connect the dots later. He doesn't have to go, I don't know where this dot's going to... I know exactly where this dot's going to connect later. Sometimes he does do that, but he doesn't always have to. He can go, all right, as long as I write this properly, I can connect something to it later. Once I figure out what that is, I don't have to decide right now, and it'll work later. And it sets him up for success down the road or for good storytelling down the road.
It's another value we talked a little about earlier about how broad his story has gotten, all the backstory he's included. When you do that, you give yourself more options and inspiration to tie stuff in later. I think about one time when he was describing the idea of his gardening style, he did say, it's, like, I don't exactly know what the garden's going to look like at the end, but I know I planted tomatoes. Right? I may choose to water them or not, but I know I did plant tomatoes. I didn't plant bananas. So it's not like a complete mystery. He has an intention for the garden. He might adjust it. It might come out a little different than he thought, but he knows what he planted. I think also about Better Call Saul, the writers of that show said that they, and it's clear when you watch it, that they harvest what they've done so far. That as they write, they're constantly looking back at what they've done, finding things to pull out from that, which I imagine George does a certain amount of that, even using the word harvest.
Yeah, that metaphor works really well for gardening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you got to get a good harvest out of that, good gardening. Yeah.
And Better Call Saul, for example, it's a prequel to Breaking Bad. So they knew certain things had to happen.
Yeah, like you
right?
can't overwrite what's already there. Yeah.
Right. But despite, so that's like their guidance. That's what they know is planted in their garden. But their writing style was generally more looking back to what they had done so far and seeing what they could pull from it. And so a lot of times when you're watching, like, oh, what a good callback to this thing earlier. It doesn't mean when they did that thing earlier, they planned for this thing happening now. It means that they look to what happened earlier to decide what to do now. And I bet George does a large amount of that.
So 2 wrap-up points before we start Aegon's Landing. So to finally finish Guinevere Greenstones' point, you should read it how you want to. I recommend reading it with Aegon's Dream in mind. You definitely don't have to. I think you should enjoy the book the way you want to. But if you want to follow along with us as well as you can, then I do recommend that having that point in your mind. Another thing, referring back to the discussion about breeding and dragons and just breeding in general, is the Valyrians were so big on just breeding in general. I mean, they're big on breeding in humans. Like, they took it to a creepy, supernatural level. So, yeah, it just fits in really well with what we already know about what things they were doing. Not necessarily House Targaryen, but things that the Valyrians were doing, which the Targaryens were very likely neck deep in as well, given their relative position in that society. So, important to keep that in mind, I'd say. But yes, the actual landing, as I said at the beginning, setting out with a small army is another Stannis parallel. Selyse even mentioned that. She's like, you're like Aegon the Conqueror going, and he's like, I don't have dragons. It's like, what the hell are you talking about, woman? Stannis with his harsh way of speaking, Melisandre's like, yes, but you do have this. And so, like, yeah, but you have this and that. And they're trying to pump him up and prepare him for, well, initial failure and then probably later failure. But along the way, lots of entertainment and setting things up for other plot lines. We'll see, won't we? Though he likely already had Harren in mind to knock off first, as we said, he had to establish himself on the mainland first, this is amazing. He sets up and he's like, I don't have a base. I don't have a lot of men. I dare you to come attack me first before I get my conquest going. And none of them did, which just probably just emboldened him and his supporters even more. It's like, we're just right here in between the Stormlands and Harren's kingdom. We're not that far from the west. Any of y'all, or the Gardeners, any of them could just march right to the mouth of the Blackwater and attack him together or separately. And it would have been interesting. And they might have even pulled it off. Certainly weren't going to bet a better chance. Right?
Yeah, if they had worked together, if they had come from different directions, because the dragons aren't quite as good on defense. Like if they're on the ground and you're suddenly getting attacked from 3 sides, I'd still might bet, especially because the dragons are good at scouting, so they might have seen it coming.
That's true. But you're right, though.
It would have been interesting, like you said. It would have been interesting. It would have been hard for Aegon's plan to have played out as well as it did.
Yeah,
if they had.
So it's funny. He says this began at the mouth of the Blackwater, a place that it seems the ancients failed to capitalize on. Aegon would literally capitalize on the place, making it his capital. Not that other lords and kings hadn't tried to rule the place. It had never been developed for various reasons. Here's a quote.
In the days of the 100 Kingdoms, many petty kings had claimed dominion over the river mouth, amongst them the Darkland kings of Duskendale, the Massies of Stone Dance, and the river kings of old, be they Mudds, Fishers, Brackens, Blackwoods, or Hooks. Towers and forts had crowned the 3 hills at various times, only to be thrown down in one war or another. Now only broken stones and overgrown ruins remain to welcome the Targaryens. Though claimed by both Storm's End and Harrenhal, the river mouth was undefended, and the closest castles were held by lesser lords of no great power or military prowess, and lords, moreover, who had little reason to love their nominal overlord, Harren the Black. Aegon Targaryen quickly threw up a log and earth palisade around the highest of the 3 hills and dispatched his sisters to secure the submission of the nearest castles.
Let's consider some of those former claims briefly. Bracken and Blackwood, that's pretty far away. Those are eyebrow-raising claims, but no, we're talking about thousands of years of history, of ins and outs and rises and falls, and yeah, Mud and Fisher and Hooks don't even exist anymore. Those houses, they all sound like they belong in the Riverlands. River Mud, River Hooks for fishing, you know. But the Bracken Blackwood claims, despite that, might be even older than these houses that are extinct. Massey is a low-key interesting player here. We'll have things to say about them on and off. As we've talked about a lot of times, there's times when houses find themselves within a sandwich. And the Masseys are an example of that. They're pretty much sandwiched between Dragonstone and Storm's End. As we said, they started to show up at Aegon's councils more, and were supposed to be vassals of Storm's End, but we're pretty clearly on Team Aegon here. So that's the side of the sandwich they gravitated towards. And what makes it difficult for them is, yeah, they're actually physically closer to Dragonstone, but there's a sea separating them from Dragonstone and the mainland, whereas Argilac could conceivably just march right up through the Stormlands and just walk right up to their door without any impediment and say, "You're on whose team now?" You're like, "Actually, okay, we'll come back." Because by themselves, the Masseys would not be able to repel an attack of the Stormlands. Of course, Harrenhal's claim to the Rivermouth was the most recent and the most dangerous. And as we saw, the Stormlands claim was somewhat rooted in creating a buffer. As we saw, Argilac the Arrogant's marriage offer was rooted in making Aegon a barrier between his lands and Harren's expansions. So the area clearly had a lot of potential. I mean, we're going to see King's Landing become the largest city in the entire realm. So clearly the area has potential, and that's obvious even without seeing the final result because it's a river mouth, and there's just so much possible trade there when you're at a river mouth. You've got the trade going upriver and the trade coming from the sea, and you're at the nexus of those two things, plus you've got land-based trade as well, and that's going to be part of why that area becomes so big. Nina says, you might compare it to White Harbor. The reason there had never been a major city at that location isn't because it isn't strategically or commercially useful. It certainly is. But because cities cost a lot of resources to build and maintain. Upfront capital is required, an amount that the Royal Stark simply didn't have. They're too busy, for example, spending their money on preparing for the next winter. They never have like an extra enough amount of cash to build a whole city, right? Like that's a lot of initial investment.
It takes a certain ambition. It takes a certain amount of I don't know, foundational wealth and ambition. And clearly the Stark motto is winter's coming. You know, they're going to, rather than, if they ever have a surplus, rather than investing in building a new city, they're going to set it aside for the next winter.
Yeah, and you might argue, too, some Starks might be like, why do we want to increase the population of the North? That's just more mouths to feed, especially in a city that doesn't produce, cities don't produce food. The lands around them might, but cities produce like goods and wealth and intellect.
They could trade that for imported food. It's
Yes.
I think it's a little short-sighted to not want the city.
I agree. But
understandable to be short-sighted when you live in a desolate, frozen wasteland.
Yeah, you might not see how that would work out to your benefit. You might be like, adding all these people, that sounds like a terrible idea. In the long term, actually, it works out really well. But getting over that hump of that long term might cause a lot of suffering until the Manderleys come in with their big amount of extra cash. And like, oh, now all of a sudden, we do have that option. And that was just credit to, I forget which Stark it was like, maybe now we can build that city because these guys are coming in with all this cash. Let's do it. Yeah, so, which also gives us a lesson about the relative wealth of these different places and how wealth can only go so far when it comes to military power. It can help it, but it also can't overcome it sometimes. Like, the Manderleys would never have been able to defeat the Starks, not in a million years. But they might have been able to outspend them. Of course, they were spending for them instead of against them because they wanted to come live in their lands. But hey, same difference in terms of possibilities. Let's talk about who...
Yeah, think of the...
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but just think about the nature of how resources would get used, saved, accumulated, invested, or whatever in the North and the Reach, for example. So in the North, they would constantly spend a lot of effort chopping down trees and then burning that wood just to stay warm.
Mm-hmm.
In
Yeah.
the South, they would spend a lot of effort planting orchards and in harvesting apples and peaches to trade to the North for wood or eat to stay on and on and on. Does that make sense?
It
Like the
does.
North just has to incinerate their work to not die in a winter, where the South barely faces a winter. And instead of incinerating their wealth, they have enough food already and they trade it for more wealth. And so they build cities and on and on.
They
and
have
on.
they can make the initial investment. They've got enough money in the bank for that. Yeah, like the Lannisters have. That's why they have Lannisport, and the Reach has Old Town, and the Vale has Gulltown. Like these places all have a city that represents where they were able to make that an investment. The closest in the north prior to White Harbor was, I guess, Barrowton, which is a substantial large town, but not large enough to be a city. Let's talk about who Aegon had on his side. Team Aegon, we'll call it. Obviously, Visenya and Rhaenys are well known, and we'll expand on those two later, as well as on Aegon. They're important, deep dive topics. But they obviously didn't do it alone, those three, apart from Orys Baratheon, who we discussed last time a bit, and we'll have more to say about him. Let's consider who else they had. The ones who were there with him from the beginning. Some of these names you've heard before because we've talked about these houses. We focused on them individually. And of course, their position within Aegon's conquest and his reign thereafter was important when we're focusing on those houses. For example, House Velaryon. Lord Daemon was his first admiral, became his master of ships once these things got settled. His sons, Lord Daemon's sons, Aethan would be the next master of ships and Lord of Driftmark, and Corlys would be the first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, which doesn't come along for a little while yet. But still, these guys, before they had these roles, before Aethan was the Master of Ships in place of his father, and before Corlys became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, well, these guys weren't babies then. We're only talking about 10 years later. This guy didn't become Lord Commander of the Kingsguard when he was 20, probably. So, I mean, it's possible, but my point is probably these guys participated in the early wars at Aegon's side as warriors and commanders before they got these later, more fancy titles when things were more established. We talked about the Celtigars, or Celtigars if you prefer. Lord Crispian, or Kispri. I don't know. You can't do that one with a hard C, can you? Scrispian? Yeah, Scrispian. Soon he was the Master of Coin, or Master of Soin, if you prefer. He would have already been funding weaponry, ships, supplies, probably. I don't know if he would have been in the battles, but maybe. Yeah. Quentin Coharis, he probably fought because he was the Dragonstone Master at Arms. That guy was a warrior. He's the one who taught Aegon and Orys and Visenya, because Visenya is certainly very capable with Dark Sister. So when we say those people trained together, especially Aegon and Orys, they learned to sword fight together, this was the guy teaching them. So he almost certainly marched with them, unless he was ancient by this time, which is possible, but probably not. He was probably appointed to this position of Master at Arms by their father, Lord Aerion. And if he's older than we think, then he might have been appointed by Lord Aerion's father, Damian. So this Coharis guy, Quentin, would have been around for at least one prior lord, if not more. And thus he would have had a lot of authority, social authority over Aegon and Orys, even though they clearly are way above him in rank. Just the fact that he had a teaching position over them, was able to tell them what to do. It's kind of a different kind of relationship. Most of these nobles, no one tells them what to do, but you have an instructor that you're supposed to listen to. It's kind of a different sort of pseudo version of that, where yes, you're ultimately in charge of this guy giving you orders, but you got to listen to him to learn the things he's teaching you. So it's kind of there's a little more of a personal relationship involved there and a little more back and forth. So it's kind of an interesting thing there. And relevant to his age, Quentin at this point had 2 sons and 1 grandson. So that's why he might have been older. The sons almost certainly fought in the war as well. The grandson probably didn't, though maybe he did. Maybe he was old enough. The grandson's the one who's going to inherit Harrenhal later. So it's possible the 2 sons die during these wars. Or maybe one of them does and then the other dies later before they can inherit Harrenhal, before Lord Quentin dies. Anyway, a lot of possibilities there. It's Lord Tristan Massey who comes over from Stone Dance. and Lord Bar Emmon of Sharp Point. So yeah, we can assume pretty much all these guys were involved in the conquest in various ways, whether swords in hand or coins being spent, and then afterwards towards these building projects. For example, the Aegon Fort. We talked about the large earthen wood palisade built around Aegon's High Hill. That's what it eventually became to be known as. We don't know what it was called at this point. And a lot of that would have been paid for by Celtigar and Velaryon, and the manpower used to build it, same deal. Would have been a lot of their people doing it, not just Aegon's. A lot have been his vassals. So it's mentioned that his sisters were sent out to get the submissions of some of the local lords. And this is almost an automatic. They're going to show up with a big dragon and the ability to bring more men to the field. And these are just small, petty lords that don't really have the ability to stand up. These are the ones that would have bent the knee right away had the letters been addressed to them. But no, the letters just went to the 7 kings / princess, queen, etc. Not these lesser lords. But they would have known about it. Of course, they would have heard. Everyone would have been talking about it. So they'd have been like, yeah, when he comes, we'll bend the knee. We're not going to fight that. I mean, come on, get serious here. We've got 300 men. You know, what are we going to do? Like, Aegon doesn't have a lot for a conquest, but he's got more than we do. And he's got the dragons. So we're bending the knee. So who is that?
Aegon wanting to take conquest against a whole continent is one thing. Aegon wanted to take conquest against a village? Like, yeah, of course.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, that part's easy. They're like, yeah, you got it. That's one of those examples where whoever rides in and says, I'm in charge now, they're going to be like, okay, we're not going to stop you. You're in charge now. You said so, and we can't tell you otherwise. So yeah, there would have been a lot of smaller, perhaps unnamed lesser lordlings around here. Some that we know a little better. Like, we know Visenya went to Crackclaw Point. They still consider themselves, quote, good dragon men. Dick Crabbs said that exact thing. We'll come back to this a little later, because this might have come a little bit later. I'm not sure when Crackclaw Point submitted. There's not a lot of manpower there. It wouldn't have been high on the list. And it's a little farther north, so it's not that near to the Blackwater. But at some point that happened. We're not exactly told which ones bend the knee immediately, except for a couple examples, which includes Rosby. Rhaenys went there. There was no resistance. Rosby just bent the knee. Visenya went to Stokeworth. Nominal resistance at Stokeworth. They fired a few crossbow bolts at her. She burned their roof. They surrendered. She probably knew it would only take a little bit. They're like, all they're firing is a few This is a very half-hearted defense here. I think they're ready to surrender. I'm just going to show them a little bit of what we're capable of. One blast from Vhagar. They're like, okay, that's enough. We're done. We fought you, though. We can say we tried to resist. A little bit of bravery, but that's it.
I was going to say that might be a similar scenario to what we were talking about earlier, maybe on a bigger scale, but maybe the lords and leaders here know they need to at least show some effort, whether it's to make their people feel better about their identity or to make their liege lord not want revenge later when the dragon's not around, whatever it is. I could see Aegon and Visenya and whoever like understanding and respecting that too. I think it was probably a discussed part of the plan. I think that they, as we said earlier, I think that Aegon probably did have a little more foresight into how this is going to play out, all the if-thens of the scenario. I bet he did understand the idea that we need to let them save face. We can't just embarrass everybody. Right?
Yes, that's very true, because it's absolutely ties to what you said before about them looking like cowards. You can't embarrass them, because that's part of what enables them to rule their lands well, is people believing that they will do what they say, people believing that they're strong. You don't want to piss off someone who's strong. You might risk pissing off someone who's weak. Yeah.
Like, not being able to defeat a dragon isn't weak.
Yeah.
Immediately surrendering to someone's letter is weak.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
or let's recall that excellent line from House of the Dragon: an unwillingness to murder is not weakness, right? There's a lot of things that are not cowardice that some people may call cowardice just because they're trying to use the framing of cowardice as a motivator against you.
You know what I think of?
Doesn't make me a coward.
I think of there's the iconic Back to the Future through line in all the movies. That was Marty McFly's fatal weakness.
Oh, yeah.
No one calls me yellow.
No one calls me coward, no matter what movie it was. Chicken.
Good point.
That was the thing that every time he shouldn't have done something. He shouldn't have.
You're right.
But he did.
And we talked about that with Victarion and how that's all Euron had to do to get Victarion to sail across the globe was like, oh, you're scared, huh? Well, I'm not scared.
Yeah.
I'll sail anywhere. That was it. He wasn't going to do it. He's like, I don't want to do that. That's just like a lot of work. What's the point? He's like, oh, you're scared? He's like, oh, I'll do it. That's all. It's like, the easiest thing ever.
It's like Jim toying with Dwight or something.
Yeah, it's like, all you got to do is bring up cowardice. And it's like the higher thinking shuts off.
D toying with Mac, like,
yeah,
you probably can't even spin the bowling ball, can you?
Oh, I can spin it. She said I couldn't spin it though. She said it. I have to do it. I have to prove her wrong. I must. She called me out. I have to respond. That's like, what? I have to. You have no choice. So interestingly, we talk about manpower. We talk about Aegon's little bit of manpower, and we look at what Stannis does eventually. Is he gets a hold of some money, and he's like, "I'm hiring mercenaries. I need manpower." Aegon had money, didn't hire mercenaries. Now there's, like I said, surely could have afforded them. The Celticars, the Velaryons, and the Targaryens combined, surely they had plenty of cash. We even hear that they used their position in the Narrow Sea to get wealthy off of passing trade. So we know they had plenty of cash. But it goes against this power attitude projection thing. He's like, I don't need help. I don't need allies. I don't need hired hands. Everyone who fights for me because they're loyal to me, because they believe in my supremacy, not because I paid them. So it doesn't really fit with that. It also kind of looks bad to bring in sellswords. It just, Westerosi nobility and cultural values. Yeah, they don't like sellswords. They look down on. Like, people don't like people Westerosi don't like people who fight for gold. Fighting for loyalty, that's a virtue. Now, obviously, we can quibble with that, but that's not the point. The point is that is how Westerosi people tend to think, especially the higher lords. So this would look bad if he used sellswords.
The sellswords also bring other, I don't know, unreliable dynamics into play. What if the sellswords do start to pillage towns that he didn't want, or turn against them, or on and on? So, and
even though they had enough money to hire them, they're not the richest. What if the Gardeners or Lannisters use their greater wealth to suborn those units? Notably, the Gardeners and Lannisters and folks didn't appear to hire mercenaries of their own either. But that's, again, because of these cultural values, most likely. So yeah, if they didn't want to do it, it's the same reason Aegon doesn't want to do it.
They might have had less ability too. Like, they're on the landlocked and or on the far side of like, what's the timing? How is someone from the Reach? What sellswords are they going to hire?
You know? The Vale could have, or the Stormlands probably could have from overseas. They might have had time, and maybe even the North. But you're right. The West and the Reach might have been more difficult for them to get people over there in time for it to matter. Because this didn't exactly take a long time. Even though Aegon didn't rush to the conquest, he had things to do first, like build the Aegon fort and get the submission of nearby lords and continue to equip these new people and get them to fight his way and all that. These things are slow, marching from town to town and getting everybody together. Yeah, there is a substantial amount of time, but it's longer to bring mercenaries over from Essos by ship.
You need a more substantial amount of time to find the sellswords, negotiate a contract, transport them over, get them to your capital or whatever. Yeah, and in the meantime, a dragon might just go burn them.
Yeah. And a smaller amount of troops does have some advantages to it. It makes you leaner as a force. You need fewer supplies. You need fewer commanders. You can move quicker. Yeah, you don't have to get everyone organized. Like, marching a large force takes getting everybody up at a certain time and then coordinating when they're going to leave. You can't all just leave at the same time when there's 10,000 of you. You're the road isn't wide enough, so you have to coordinate that and arrange for that. Okay, this group goes first. This group goes second. This group goes third. The wagons have to be there's a lot. There's a lot to it, especially, let's keep in mind, folks, no King's Road. No paved roads hardly at all around here. So there's marching through beaten paths. And that does make troop movements a little bit harder. So, again, smaller amount of troops helps dodge some of these logistical problems. It's easy to forget, alongside those roads, that there's none of the later institutions and power structures that will eventually be around will be there. Obviously, no King's Landing, not even the start of a city at this point, perhaps. Some hovels and fishing villages, maybe. Aegon's timber and earth fortress was just that. It wasn't a city yet. It wasn't the start of a city. It was just a fortress. It eventually becomes the Red Keep. But that area was low population. So this is a portion of the mainland was not tightly held. This entire area, even though it had been claimed by Harren and Argilac and some of their ancestors, but if they waited, that might change. Like Harren might start to exert his authority more directly over this area. So there were some independent sources of manpower the Targaryens wanted to claim before it was too late. Like if those nearby, if Duskendale or Rosby had been taken over by Black Harren, well, that's just another obstacle for them that's very close to where they're establishing their base. So even beyond the timing of stealing a Harren's thunder by landing the same day he finishes his castle, there are other considerations as well in terms of where Harren would go next. Okay, he finished his castle. What's he going to do after that? Probably expand his territory. Okay, so it's multiple reasons to stop him before he gets any farther, because those soldiers become his if he takes those places. And if you get them first, those are your soldiers. So that's a double whammy. Like you don't have to face those troops; they're fighting for you. And it's not just the troops; it's the money. Yeah, exactly. So it's pretty smart. Let's talk about the Aegon fort. Again, here's a map shot that shows us the three major hills, nicely aligned with the three heads of the dragon. How convenient. Rhaenys' Hill, Visenya's Hill, Aegon's High Hill. And you can see the eventual, if you're looking at the map, you can see eventually where King's Landing was developed. You can see how it formed, the walls, which of course weren't there at this point, but these denominations, these markers might have been there, like proto-structures would have been built. Atop Visenya's and Rhaenys' Hill would have been watchtowers, smaller fortresses, things like that. And the fishing villages would have started to been like, hey, let's look to them for protection. We'll definitely swear fealty to these people. They've got dragons. They're building stuff. This looks good to us. They're not enslaving people like Harren. So, pardon me, if they're choosing between the people that have claimed the territory and the people who are actually present doing so, it's pretty much a no-brainer. Like, you'd obviously rather follow the Targaryens, I think, than Harren. That's easy. Now, Argilac is different because he's a follower of the Seven. But still, I think you'd rather follow Aegon because he just seems more capable, and Argilac his kingdom has been pushed back for a while, so from reputation, yes, Argilac is dangerous and powerful, but his kingdom has been shrinking. So he might seem, whereas Aegon's the one on the rise, so he might seem like the better alternative in terms of going forward, in addition to maybe seeming more powerful, even with fewer troops.
Also, if it's close, even if it's not close, the person standing in front of you is the one you're more likely to follow, right? Whether they have 30,000 troops or 3,000 troops, when they're standing in front of you with 3,000 troops, like, okay, what do you want us to do now? Yeah.
So nowadays, atop those hills is the Red Keep, the Great Sept of Baelor, and the ruins of the Dragon Pit. For a while, it had the actual Dragon Pit, but you kind of wonder what was there first. It's interesting to think about how, like, let's frame it this way. Imagine King Aegon with his enormous dragon, his ancient Valyrian heraldry. He's knelt to receive this. He's already been crowned, by the way. This is before the crowning at the Starry Sept, of course. That's the one that everyone remembers and the one that Aegon dates his reign for. But he was crowned as soon as he landed by Visenya. That Valyrian steel circlet that he wears, the one that's worn by many kings after him, is placed on his head at this point. As soon as he makes landfall, which I believe is a parallel to William the Conqueror. But think about this. This is neat. Like, all the dragons, his sisters, the heraldry, the sword barely matched anywhere in the world, Blackfire, and all this is happening in a log fort around a hill. Like, that's not quite as fancy as it will be later. It's like all this really powerful heraldry, ancient stuff in a log cabin. It's not a cabin, but it's funny. It makes the example stand out a little more if I call it a cabin. And at some point, it probably was just a little cabin before it expanded.
Call it a love shack.
A love shack. A three-way love shack. Yes.
I that is interesting to point out that it does create some imagery you might not expect, right? Like, I don't think anyone's made that art yet, right?
Yes.
It would be
point.
anyone listening, here's a call. But it's neat to think about how many great kingdoms started with humble beginnings. Like Genghis Khan wasn't in some castle,
He was in a
right?
yurt.
He was literally,
Yeah.
yeah. And even the I don't know, stories of like I don't know, George Washington or Abe Lincoln, born in log cabins, and
That's what I was thinking.
the writing of the Constitution. It was hot when they were writing the Constitution. It was so hot outside they wanted to open the windows, but they didn't. They kept the windows closed because there was so much horse manure outside. It smelled so bad. They kept the windows closed and just dealt with the heat. And in the meantime, they're writing the Constitution of the United States of America. That's like the conditions they were in. They weren't in some fancy castle.
It's probably like you have to be careful that their sweat doesn't drip onto the
onto the parchment.
Yeah, it was some of the original wording was lost because of sweat droplets. It was like, I don't know, you got to fill that back in. I don't know what they wrote. We got to fill that back in. Yeah, it's neat to think about that, and that is what King's Landing becomes until like Jaehaerys and Barth install like sewage systems and proper flowing water. It is kind of nasty, like you're describing.
I mean, Paris was up till I want to say like the 1700s. It was like unlivable, like even in the modern time, even in like 1970, the river in Paris, you couldn't swim or drink in it. It was poisonous.
Yeah.
It's only in the past generation as that started to be dealt with. So.
And yeah, you got to figure it's probably similar. The mouth of Blackwater is probably highly polluted, is with less with industrial waste, but there'd be some because they would have logging operations and mining and stuff, and they'd be dumping wastewater in there. The ancient world could produce some pretty severe waste, even compared to modern times. Probably because they didn't know what some of the consequences were, and we still don't. So they knew even less.
When you start to have cities, when you start to have populations of scores of thousands of people, that's when human waste starts to matter.
Yeah, and of course nowadays in King's Landing, it's become a problem again because it's outgrown some of its own sewage system. There's multiple characters who talk about King's Landing smell. It's like, oh, I can smell it before I got there. And someone like Davos says every city has a distinct smell, and King's Landing's is the worst of the 5, by far. So the landing was progressing pretty well. But meanwhile, what was going on elsewhere in the realm? We've really focused just on this, but there had to be a lot of back and forth discussions, a lot of ravens and horse messengers between the lords and ladies in the region as things progress. Like this Aegon guy, he's built a castle now. He's claimed a few lords. Like he's doing what he said he would do. Is someone going to stop him? Well, again, this was the time to maybe gang up on him and do something. No one did it. When he just has an earthen castle, not even a castle, still a dragon sitting there, or 3 dragons. That's not exactly as simple as I might portray it. But again, it's still probably their best chance to stop him, and they didn't do that. No one else wanted to be the one to. Well, let them do it. Let someone else stop him. Let Argilac do it. Let Heron do it. Let the Westerlands do it. No one wanted to be the first, except for maybe a few smaller scale people that were really close by. And the people living in what's now the Crownlands, as I said, it wasn't the Crownlands then. It quickly did become that. They rarely, if ever, had strong leadership. There's a long history of people being caught in the middle, of this region being like the neutral zone that's sort of quibbled over, occasionally fought over, and has just had a revolving door of leadership. They're probably pretty sick of it. They're probably like, yeah, this puts us at risk. Anyone can just come in here and shred us and take our stuff, and there'd be nothing we could do about it. It'd be nice to have a strong leader to tie us all together and protect us.
Silly question for you.
What's that?
So when some of the Crown lands were owned by like Heron, would he have called them the Drown lands?
Oh!
And I guess it would have been Gardeners had some of the Crown lands. Was it the Groan lands?
I'm groaning at this joke.
Okay.
The Ground lands.
Anyway.
That's turning into the Frown lands.
Yeah, that's what got me started. Actually, was Frown. I was thinking of Frown lands. I was like, they probably were frowning anyway. So I was like, what else?
And when all the human waste piles up, it's the Brown lands.
The Brown lands.
It is. Oh, that's hilarious. I like that one best of all, I think, actually. Nice.
Any other ideas, folks? What other rhymes could we fit in there?
If
they had enough court
lands.
Gestures. Oh, the Meow
Meow
lands.
lands.
I was thinking if there were enough court gestures, it could be the Clown
Oh, I
lands.
like the Clown lands
Nice.
too.
Nice.
Okay, that's a good
The
one.
clown god. I accidentally said that once. The clown
Yeah, you
god.
did.
Now we believe. That's what Patchface actually worships, the clown god. That's why it's so creepy, because clowns are creepy, man. Yeah. I would rather live in the Crown Lands than the Clown Lands, for sure. Yikes.
I would rather live in the clown lands.
Really?
I don't have the same aversion to clowns that I think a lot of people do. To me, they are a funny jester. I like clowns. Clowns are fun. But I
Clowns
get that
are
you don't.
funny, as Homer would say. So the fact that the people have had a hard time in this area and that it's never had stability, or has rarely had stability, or hasn't had stability for long periods of time, is why this next quote is actually believable and maybe not just a rewriting of history to make Aegon seem a little better, a history written by the winners kind of situation. Here, judge for yourself. Quote.
Heraldic banners have long been a tradition amongst the lords of Westeros, but such had never been used by the dragon lords of Old Valyria. When Aegon's knights unfurled his great silken battle standard with a red three-headed dragon breathing fire upon a black field, the lords took it for a sign that he was now truly one of them, a worthy high king for Westeros. When Queen Visenya placed a Valyrian steel circlet studded with rubies on her brother's head, and Queen Rhaenys hailed him as Aegon, first of his name, king of all Westeros, and shield of his people, the dragons roared, and the lords and knights sent up a cheer. But the small folk, the fishermen, and field hands and goodwives shouted loudest of all.
Yeah, when I first read that quote, I was like, did they really? But the more we've delved into it, I'm like, yeah, I can maybe kind of believe it, that they did want a strong leader, and this looked like it, and they were right. So it's not a case of, yay, someone new to boss us around. It's a case of someone looking like they may actually be capable of being a good leader, something this region lacked. It looked like a reprieve from the inevitability of Harren, who had not treated his subjects well, to put it mildly, and was probably coming for them. They might have been like, uh-oh, how much longer do we have before this guy comes into our region and enslaves us and makes us worship the drowned god or cut down werewoods or whatever he's going to have us do. And it also looked like Aegon was going to create opportunities. He was going to build a city or a castle or both, and that means infrastructure. That means, in modern terms, that's like creating jobs and creating work and creating stability. Still, even with that point made, it's hard to imagine there weren't plenty of doubters, malcontents, and people who were strong worshippers of the Seven that didn't really see this guy as the answer because he was not godly. Even if he was making some godly noises, still, there's some obvious violations of cultural traditions laid down by the Seven, like multiple wives, like dragons, like their history being disconnected from all that, like they're not Andals. There might have been some racism or prejudice, whatever the Westerosi equivalent is, from the fact that they're not like us or whatever.
Another thought, depending on your interpretation, that this could all be accurate, but it's being presented as kind of like we're supposing here, like, oh, this hero has come to save us, and so we're going to cheer. But there could also have been fear. They might have thought, he's about to burn us all to death with the dragon so that other people from some other land can move into our farms. Oh, no, he wants to be our king. Okay, fine. He's not burning us with dragons. Yay! Not burning us with dragons. That's enough to cheer for. So
yeah. I agree, yeah. And there's also a possibility, if we have to keep in mind, of paid malcontents. That's always a possibility. Whenever you have a crowd, whenever you have a riot break out, there's always a possibility that someone incited it, and that may have been intentional. It may have not just been someone who's really mad. Because sometimes a riot is incited by a person who's genuinely angry, and that flame sort of catches and goes to a lot of places that are unpredictable. But sometimes, like the King's Landing bread riot, there's suspicions that someone tried to, maybe add a little kindling to that, or a little spark to that fire, and maybe get that going. So there's a ripe opportunity here for that. I don't know if Harren or Argilac were the type to do this, or maybe Shara Aaron or Princess Maria or anyone else. Doesn't have to be one of the greater kings, sending some agents there to maybe stir up the crowds against Aegon and be like, no, death to Dragon Lord. Maybe not quite that blatant, but people who would boo and maybe encourage other people to boo and go around and get the vibe of like, are they happy about this, or are the people going along with this? And then go report back to the kings and lords back in their native regions and being like, yeah, he's making progress. The people are following him. They're accepting him as their ruler. So this is progressing, and he is going to come for us eventually, and they might use that sort of intrigue to try to stop it. Maybe there were assassination attempts earlier than this. We know that they happened from the Dornish, but maybe there were some earlier ones. It's not super clear, but that would be a thing to do, right? Like, rather than try to beat the dragons head on, you wouldn't want to admit to doing this necessarily, because it's not honorable. It's not noble to assassinate a foe. You're supposed to beat them on the battlefield. That's the Westerosi value. But if no one knows you did it, you might still have a pragmatic reason to do it without other people knowing. And if maybe you have to have the ability to pull that off. You have to have a spy network, or you have to have assassins. I'm not sure that Argilac had that. I'm not sure that Harrenhal had that sort of thing, but someone might.
Yeah, I'm going to suppose when I think about this that it's not likely. Maybe from a smaller, more local house, but I think that the other lords are too arrogant. They're just not worried about him. They're not scouting. They're like we talked earlier. He landed. Right. They could have got him. They just he landed. All right, whatever. They were almost indifferent. And maybe some that maybe would have cared or would have done something too far away, like the North's too far away to send a scout down there and get all the way back. Like, it might have been too difficult. And also the North, maybe it doesn't seem like their MO, that kind of like subversive, sneaky kind of thing, not their kind of thing, but maybe Lannisport, maybe the Lannisters might have sent some scouts over there. They're the ones that might be most likely to have had some spying or assassination attempts, but they also are the type to be so arrogant to not think it matters. Like, he's not really going to do this. We've been here thousands of years. We're also farther removed, like physically our land is farther away from what's going on than, the Stormlands and the Riverlands. So.
Right on. Well said. Well point. Let's talk about the newness of the banner and the sigil itself. Nina says I think it was a conscious decision from the pre-conquest Targaryens to maintain a separate identity from continental Westeros. Remember how even Illyrio and the Braavosi Mom Mordana mock the Westerosi fondness for sigils. I don't think the Valyrians would have been any different in seeing sigils as a silly, barbaric custom of the West, proof of their lack of refinement compared to the Dragon Lords of Valyria. The Targaryens, the last of these Dragon Lords, might have thought that if they stooped to this level and adopted their own sigil, they would lose some of that Valyrian distinction. But Aegon apparently saw it differently. He saw it being one of them was necessary to rule them. And it seems he may have been right. This distance, this separation is not a benefit to rulership in a lot of ways. It might make them feel better about their pride and their superiority as a culture, but it's not going to win them friends and allies. You're not going to overawe that many people by being snooty. And we've seen this in the real world a lot. Like, there were some of the kings of England that also ruled kingdoms in France at the time when they were during the times like the Angevin dynasty and the some of the others that ruled that area. There were multiple kings of England that didn't speak English. Like, that's a good example of like, oh, I'm too good to speak English. Well, if you had, you might not have lost England. That was a real point against you when things really came to a head. Whereas Aegon's the opposite. He's like, I'm going to be as much like them as I can to win them over and make things go smoother. I'm not going to force this change on them because it's too big of a change. It sets up rebellions. It sets up bad feelings. It sets up resentment. William the Conqueror behaved similarly. Now, they already shared a religion, France and England, when he subjugated England, but still he adopted a lot of local customs in some ways. Some things he changed dramatically, which Aegon will do as well, and some of his descendants will, but whenever possible, he tried to make it easy so that they wouldn't have as many reasons to unite against these changes that they disagree with because they're so deeply rooted, or they're so used to it, or they just they've been long disliked the values held by this other side. They're predisposed towards hating Targaryen beliefs or Valyrian religion, things like that. They're never going to accept that. So, yeah.
Another factor to consider here. Probably the primary point or origin of these banners is battlefield signaling. Like, we're the good guys. This is home base. That's the captain over there, right? They're starting up a war with new armies, new soldiers from new lands. It might have been a practical thing that Aegon realized beyond this sort of symbolicness and incorporating the culture, but also we need to know that those are our troops and those are the enemy troops, and our troops need to know like what, et cetera, et cetera. There's some practical value to establishing a banner for the soldiers on the field.
That's a good point. Yeah, you wonder if they used banners and not heraldic banners in war for like that. Like this was the symbol of the first company, but they're not tied to one house or one family. They're just a unit of the state, something like that. Which, because you're right, like
sometimes
the idea that they didn't have any banners in battle is weird. But not having a family, so that's not weird.
You can imagine the Targaryens didn't have to fight many battles, and when they did, they're on dragons. They're not worried about whose troops are on the ground. They're all bad guys. Just go burn them with your dragon. But now, when you're trying to use troops, and some of the troops are new to your side, and you don't have as many dragons, there's all these reasons. Sometimes banners on a battlefield too would be like, there'd be banners of a house, signaling what faction you were, and some sub houses and allies, and all these different things. But sometimes there would just be like color coded stuff, like the most obvious, famous is just a white flag, is peace, retreat, or whatever. But there would be many other ways to signal on a battlefield with a banner or a flame or whatever else.
Yeah, and as well, there would be examples of this is just how it's always been. This is how Westerosi peasants have been trained to fight. Why reinvent the wheel? They know to follow a banner. They know that's how they've been taught and trained. Why reinvent warfare? Like that works well enough. Yeah, so why change that? Just do the way it's always been. Again, that simplify. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel here. It's also interesting to consider that whether the Celtigars and Velaryons, when did they come up with a banner? Did they do it when the Targaryens did? Like, okay, we'll also become part of this, or did they already do it? Have they already adopted some of those customs? Maybe that's part of why Aegon did. He's like, hey, it actually just worked out pretty well for these guys. Let's do it also, but from a greater position of strength rather than just trying to fit in. We're trying to fit in so that we can dominate, not just trying to fit in so we can be prosperous, which are not the same approach. But also the symbol itself is interesting. Like you can see why the Celtigars picked their symbol, and because Claw Isle is full of crabs, I guess, and the seahorse, they're a naval power. But a three-headed dragon, I mean, that seems to indicate Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys. It seems pretty straightforward. But it might be related to a dream. If Aegon's dream involved the three-headed dragon doing these things, or a symbolic three-headed dragon uniting the realm, which may come again with Dany and her three dragons maybe uniting the realm. Maybe that's what he actually dreamed of and thought it was him. Maybe it was both. Again, we have to keep a very open mind, literally, for the conception and possibility of what Aegon's dream or dreams told him and how he interpreted them. There's two different things there. There's what the dream actually indicated and what he thought of it. And actually a possible third thing is when he's telling his sisters and perhaps close friends about it, what's their interpretation of it? And then,
or when his sisters are telling him about the dream that they had.
Yeah, there's an entirely, you're right. Or the dreams that they read about in Signs and Portents that Dany had written down. They're corroborating these different things, and like it's just so wide open, the possible interpretations.
By the way, aside from dream interpretations, another angle to take on the reasoning of their sigil with the three dragon heads is it could represent a family of dragons. It's not one dragon, right? Like we have a lot of dragons.
Yeah,
we're a family of dragons. You maybe you win one battle or you beat one dragon, but we're a whole family of dragons. It kind of going back to the overwhelming force here. You can't beat us. Sorry, we have a family of dragons.
Not that a Hydra exists in that war in Westeros, not that I know of, but it fits that idea. You cut one head off and two more just grow in its place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can't beat it by just cutting one head off. Nina wants to also bring up the title that Aegon is claiming because it's pretty interesting, and this is a great catch by her, a great subtopic to consider. It is not the one Aegon or any of the other Targaryen kings end up adopting. It's distinctly non-feudal. Aegon is describing himself as king of all Westeros, eliminating the politico-cultural borders, which had divided Westeros for the better part of 8,000 years. This is Aegon as absolute monarch, redefining the realm not just as a single political entity, but a state which he controls totally and personally. That absolutism extends to the second half of the title. Aegon is personally pledging to defend, quote, his people without the intervention of their feudal or pre-conquest overlords. Aegon also does not put any emphasis on his familial name for all his willingness to adopt a sigil in the manner of established Westerosi dynasties. He is ruling the realm as his own person, rather than as merely the representative of a new dynasty. What Nina means by that last part, Aegon, first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of his people. Not Aegon Targaryen, first of his name, king of all Westeros and shield of his people. Not Aegon of House Targaryen, just Aegon, first of his name, king of all. They do not mention the word Targaryen, and that is a quote. That is what they're saying Queen Rhaenys actually said. Those are apparently her exact words. They don't say the word Targaryen. Very interesting. That's why I call this a very good catch, because I didn't notice that the word Targaryen wasn't used in that declaration, and it's very notable when you think about it. I don't exactly know what they meant, but I like Nina's take on it. It's another power move. It's like, yeah, me.
Mm-hmm.
I will decide who my heir is. Right? I will have kids, and that won't necessarily be the way it goes, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. Well, I welcome other interpretations and takes on this spot. Speaking of a change of leadership, let's also remind ourselves briefly what else was happening elsewhere in the world as we make our way towards the end of this episode. This was happening roughly coordinated with the end of the era known as the Century of Blood. I mean, Aegon fought in the Century of Blood, so did Argilac. They fought in some wars during it. And Argilac and Aegon... Argilac may have fought in some stuff before that, too. We just know he fought against Volantis, and so did Aegon. But there's lots of tumult and chaos in the Century of Blood. It's a whole century. We know a lot about it, but there's a hell of a lot we don't know about it. There's a lot of room for more things. So there was disruption everywhere. But towards the end of the Century of Blood, things were starting to settle down. Things were starting to evolve. The new world, the new era was starting to take shape. The free cities were a lot closer to actually living up to their name. They're still not free, but they're more free than they were. Slavers' Bay had been under Valyrian rule for eons and was now free to be slavers independently instead of slavers under Valyria. So the cities became self-governed, not free. That seems to be a better way to phrase it. Self-governed, yes.
Free from higher authority. Not that the people in it are free, but the rulers are independent from other rulers.
Yeah, they're more like city-states, yes. It's a bit of a reversal on a global scale. Valyria had left Westeros alone, other than, the outpost and trading with it, and sending some Valyrian steel in there. Now that they're gone, all those former territories are various shades of independent, and it's Westeros that's now set to be united under one new dynasty. Instead of Valyrian Freehold dominating Essos and so much of it, and dominating parts of the world that they don't even rule because of their great wealth and power, and no one wants to mess with them, and etc. It's the one surviving Dragonlord family is now repeating that on the one continent that Valyria had left alone. So it's just like black and white. Essos is getting freer, Westeros is getting more united. And less free in some ways, but more free in other ways, because yes, liberty isn't just telling you can do whatever you want, and being freedom also involves having the ability to be free, which you can't do if the realm is chaotic and violent and brutal, which, to start off, the area that Aegon was landing in was a little chaotic, and he was bringing peace and stability to that region and intended to bring it to the rest of the continent. So a lot of people's lives will get a lot better under him. So in some ways, they are more free to not be killed, or free to be less likely to be killed. However we're going to frame it. Certainly not simple, but simpler. Next time, we'll get into the actual beginning of the conquest, the formation of the Crown Lands, the early battles, the early allies, and most certainly we'll get to the fight with Harren. Maybe not much farther than that, but we'll see. That's the fun extra part that we're doing here with Valar Rereaders for Fire and Blood. We don't exactly know where each endpoint will be. We'll be going nice and thoroughly through everything and seeing where it takes us. Question from Dornish Dame. Shield of his people. That title interested me. You can see the link to Lord Protector of the Seven Kingdoms / Defender of the Realm, but also to shield that guard the realms of men from the Night's Watch vows. Ooh, I like that. Very important. Yeah. That's a good catch, Dornish Dame. As usual, Dornish Dame has lots of good catches. You can have...
Yeah, especially thinking in terms of like the whatever dream or vision he might have had, that he might have been
careful with his language.
This idea of shield. Yeah.
That is a good catch, yes. Maybe something we should think about more, marinate a little bit on that one, and maybe bring it up again at a later date, next week or at some other time. Trivia answer. The question was, who has struck Aegon with a blade successfully? Who's the only person we know of to do that?
My guess is Orys Baratheon in training.
I'm surprised. I think that was the most known trivia answer we've ever had.
Oh, really? And I don't know it. You're muted, Shaya, but...
Oh, I said I think that was the most known trivia answer we've ever had. I think like everyone knew it. It was just like an instant cacophony of the same answer. Visenya.
It's Visenya, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's a pretty notable tale about Visenya doing that. It's pretty memorable.
She tried to argue that he needed a Kingsguard, a devoted Kingsguard, something like it. And he's like, I don't need a Kingsguard. My guards are fine. And she's like, whoosh, cuts him in the face. He's like, your guards are slow. Like, damn, that's harsh. Like, you just cut the king in the face. I mean, he is your younger brother, but still.
Your brother.
Yeah, like, whoa, with Dark Sister. So, I was like, that's cut me in the face. Like,
point made. Yeah.
Point made, yes. Literally.
Point made on your face.
Yes. Point made on your face. Egg on your face. Oh, Aegon, your face is bleeding. So yeah, next week we will pick up where we left off. Live streams at 3 Eastern as usual.
What if we don't do that? What if we don't pick up where we left off and we just pick up somewhere else?
Well, that would be a surprise. I don't think we'll do that, but maybe we will. You never know.
Keep you on your toes.
Yeah, so I recommend Before the Dragons, Under the Dragons, Balerion, The Doom, Dragonstone, like my shirt, Valyria 1 and Valyria 2. We have 2 different Valyria episodes. The Wars of Valyria and the Valyrian Freehold. House Velaryon, House Celtigar, Century of Blood. Our Patreon episode on Mantaris. That's a really good one. I probably mentioned some other ones that I don't recall.
I'll say, don't even think about coming back here unless you've watched all of those episodes before Sunday.
O'Shea is becoming a bit of a Visenya herself here. She's projecting, yes.
Yeah, who is that? Am I the Visenya and Sean's the Rhaenys to your Aegon? Is that right?
I guess.
I don't know.
Sean's older than you, but he is maybe, I don't know.
As long as I get to marry Zeus, I'm happy.
Well, you both have to marry me.
He's definitely the Rhaenys then. The sweet one.
So I'm going to spend 10 nights with Sean for every one I spend with you.
Yeah.
Sean, you're going to die over Dorne.
Oh.
You're going to die first. That's bad for you. All right, folks. Thanks for all those of you who subscribe to us voluntarily with a monthly donation via Patreon or Spotify subscription. Both of those are valid options. So is a recurring donation through PayPal. You can set that up on through our website. Our website has other ways to support us as well. We've got some links that we get a cut of if you shop through them. Our Discord meeting, our next Discord hangout is August 24th. We've been having a lot of fun with that meeting. Yeah, meeting.
Not really a meeting.
Meeting to play games. Meeting to play this again. We're going to do Jackbox games. That won't be the case every time, but it has been the first 3 times for these. So yeah,
I'll say we had a request in the chat too. There was a discussion about cat pun names in the chat, and Lady Ray requested that we have that little round table during the beginning of our Discord hangout that we talk about cat pun names, animal pun names. Yeah,
that sounds good to me. So more incentive for the rest of y'all. You can participate in the audience participation functions of the Discord hangouts without being a patron or Spotify subscriber. But if you are, you can also directly play as one of the competing members, or writing answers, or so there's a lot of ways to participate. And
that'll be August 24th at 9 p.m. Eastern again, and we're doing these every month. So if you missed this month, just keep your eye out for next month.
Yeah, and if you're hearing this much later, if you're not hearing this live, you're hearing it months later, weeks later, just check in with our Discord or Facebook group. We keep this stuff updated, so you can always find out when the next one will be based on when you find yourself time-wise. Thanks as well to Nina.
Where are you?
Yeah, where are you? When are you?
Yeah.
When are you?
Yeah, I actually am curious. When are you? If you're listening to this years from now, please comment now and be like, I'm listening to year 2026.
I'm the three-eyed crow, seeing this from the future. Thanks as well to Nina for her great notes. A lot of excellent discussion topics. We appreciate them. Almost like we're able to get more out of less with this style of episode, because we're really delving in and discussing things a little more. There's less overview, less just me telling you things, more discussion, which Nina's additions really help fuel that. Joey, Jesse, and Bran, thanks to y'all as well for our music, our intro and outro music, and to Michael Klarfeld for the video intro. Thanks as well to our Bengineer. And we'll see you all next time for more Valar Reread Us.